He remembers a childhood spent under the moon's cold gaze. Their father trained them relentlessly, pushing them to their limits. He was preparing them for a trial he called judgment, a brutal test of skill with the younger brother always watching. The prize was a blessing from the goddess, granting immense power. The price? A journey through one of 6 monster-infested towers. A totally fair trade. His older brother, Tristan, was a prodigy destined for greatness. He stood before the spire, confident he could conquer its shifting rooms. He stepped into the unknown, a place few who enter can truly remember. The great doors sealed shut, leaving him to face the horrors within. No matter how well you prepare, there's no guarantee of a safe return. A sword falls from a weakened grasp, and some never return at all. 5 years have passed since Tristan vanished inside the Serpent Spire. Now, his younger brother stands ready to follow in his footsteps. His name is Corin Cadence, and he's next in line for judgment. The guards inspect his bag, filled with carefully chosen supplies. He even quotes the rulebook to get his gear past them. For light reading. Corin doesn't believe in luck, only in preparation. With his gear approved, the guards finally let him pass. As he climbs, Corin goes over his strategy. Avoid combat if possible. He reaches the tower's entrance, a monstrous maw of stone. His plan is to run from anything bigger than a very small goblin. He steps inside and is plunged into the abyss, the first trial beginning. He lands in a strange room filled with glowing artifacts on pedestals. A grand hall of treasures, not the dungeon he was expecting. This is definitely not the kind of death trap he'd prepared for. He examines the items, wondering if this is a test of greed. But the complete lack of traps is what truly worries him. He knows every choice he makes could alter the tower's configuration. He wonders if the test is about giving, not taking. So he pulls out a simple glass marble from his bag and places it on an empty pedestal as an offering. But his humble tribute changes absolutely nothing. With that theory debunked, he assumes the items are for the taking. He decides to leave a mysterious golden key behind. Instead, he dons a new set of light armor and equips a much sturdier sword. His final choice is a blank book. For some light reading, he wonders if the blank book is some kind of puzzle. Or perhaps it's meant to be paired with another item. Deciding it's a problem for later, he packs it away. Nothing has exploded yet, which is always a good start. He now faces 3 doors, a choice of trials. He recalls that blue often signifies a mental challenge, but the tower seems to disagree with his choice. He turns to the red door, expecting a fight. But what waits for him is definitely not a goblin. It's so cute he immediately decides it's too dangerous and leaves. He turns to the final door, considering he might be the world's worst adventurer. Beyond it lies the last room, a treacherous path over a dark abyss. This is definitely more intimidating than the cat bunny thing. Corin reflects on his aversion to violence, a weakness his father never trained out of him. But he steels his resolve, preparing for what lies ahead. He takes the first step, determined to see this through. Just then, a shadowy figure emerges from the darkness behind him. His first instinct is to say hello. Manners first, survival second. The creature responds with a silent, terrifying grin. Deciding not to engage, Corin carefully continues across the path. He reasons that the shadow won't attack if he keeps his distance. But he has a better idea than just walking the treacherous path. He decides to bypass the puzzle entirely and attempts to lasso the far platform. But his first attempt falls far short. He tries again and again and again. Practice makes perfect eventually. He feels like his own shadow is mocking his terrible aim. Just as he resolves to keep trying, the platform beneath him cracks. He realizes with horror that there's a time limit. Corin accepts that playing it safe is no longer an option. With the path crumbling beneath him, he has to think fast. He hesitates to attack the shadow, which has done nothing hostile. Instead, he has another target in mind. He unleashes a powerful blast at the giant mirror. The impact sends him into a memory of his training days, which often ended like this. A time when his brother Tristan watched on with disapproval. He remembers his father's harsh words after a sparring match. The boy could only explain that he didn't want to cause harm. A lesson his father taught him with cold steel in a single word. Pathetic. His father's voice echoes in his mind, a lecture on their family's brutal legacy. He orders Corin to fetch his cane for another lesson. Classic father-son bonding. A young girl appears, along with Tristan, who watches silently. But once their father is gone, Tristan is there to comfort his crying brother. He tells Corin that he did a great job, despite the harsh training, and that he's growing stronger every day, even if he can't see it himself. The memory fades and Corin lands hard on the crumbling stone floor. Tristan's words become his mantra, keep moving forward. He looks up just as the mirror he struck begins to glow and crack. It explodes in a shower of magical energy and stone. Corin realizes the shadow's blast was far more powerful than his own. Before he can react, the shadow unleashes another attack. He complains that his double isn't playing fair. Because monsters are known for their sportsmanship. But the cracking floor reminds him that time is running out, and his shadowy opponent is already charging another blast. He's forced to run, dodging a relentless barrage of energy. He considers trying to outlast the shadow, hoping it has limited mana. But a quick glance at those glowing eyes tells him that's a terrible idea. He needs a new plan, something better than just running. He realizes the shadow must be tied to the mirror itself. He realizes he's wasting time and has one last theory to test. He activates a hidden mechanism on his sword's hilt. The blade cracks, unleashing a wave of energy that engulfs the shadow. His opponent dissolves into a puddle of black goo. Corin can hardly believe he actually managed to defeat it. He then realizes it was just an illusion created by the mirror. With his brother's words as his guide, he moves on to the next challenge. A grand chessboard awaits him, a game of valor. For a light mental warm-up. This is a test he feels much more comfortable with. A standard game of tactics common among the nobility. He makes his first move, advancing a piece across the board. The goal is simple. Corner the opponent's goddess until she cannot move. This brings back a memory of playing against a girl named Sarah. She would often mock him for his predictable strategies. Corin would retort with his own brand of childish sarcasm, which usually ended with a chess piece to the head. Just some friendly childhood trauma to build character. Back in the present, Corin admits that if the tower plays like Sarah, he's in deep trouble. He then notices 3 golden doors, just like in the previous room. Deciding to stay consistent, he resolves to stick with the golden path. He approaches the golden door, only to find it locked. A sudden realization dawns in his eyes. He confirms that all 3 doors require a key to open. He thinks back to the key from the first room, but pulls out the blank book instead. Except it's no longer blank. A title has appeared on the cover. He opens it to find a perfect description of the mirror room he just escaped. The book is a guide, a key to surviving the tower's trials. He realizes he's been carrying the instruction manual this whole time. He quickly finds the entry for his current challenge, the Room of Valor. But the book's warning about a rising mist leaves him confused. He quickly realizes the mist is pouring from grates in the floor. The book's warning was literal, and he needs to act fast. He frantically scans the board, looking for a solution. He notices the red side is missing a piece, a space he could have filled with the ruby statue from the first room. But the book never said he had to play with a handicap. So he chooses the blue side, because he enjoys winning. Then it hits him. With the mist rising so quickly, there's no time for a full game. This isn't a test of strategy, but of speed. He makes a single bold move, capturing an enemy piece. With a single move, he corners the red goddess, ending the game. A brilliant red key materializes on the board as his prize. He celebrates his victory, calling it smart tactics, not cheating. Winner's prerogative. But his celebration is cut short by a sudden realization. He wonders if his brute force win earned him a specific key. He still approaches the golden door, committed to his path. But he can't help but compare the key he won to the one he left behind. With the mist still rising, he decides to test a theory. He tries the red key on the orange door, hoping for a match. But the tower responds with a violent, ominous rumble. The door opens into a chamber of impossible scale. A sudden noise makes Corin's blood run cold. Something massive slithers from the darkness above. He finds himself face to eye with a colossal serpent. So much for running from anything bigger than a goblin. Corin is frozen in place, utterly overwhelmed. The beast descends, its maw wide enough to swallow him whole. He scrambles back through the doorway just as it slams shut. He decides bravery is irrelevant when faced with a literal god beast. Abandoning that path entirely, he rushes to the golden door. For a moment, he questions why he ever came here at all. He pushes his doubts aside, focusing on his true goal, finding Tristan, and hopefully avoiding any more near-death experiences with giant monsters. He takes a deep breath and steps into the next trial, a massive chamber with a wide chasm of water. The familiar 3 doors wait on the other side. He spots a large grate on his side of the gap, and a set of levers that might be the key to crossing. But first, he decides to test the water. Just in case it's some kind of flesh-melting acid. A single drop falls onto his hand. He immediately panics, shaking his hand as if it's on fire. But after a moment of frantic flailing, nothing happens. He quickly tries to play it off as if he knew it was just water all along. A totally calculated risk. With the immediate danger gone, he wonders about the room's purpose. It all feels too simple, so he turns to his trusty guide for answers. The book offers a cryptic clue: the room of false choices. A message that is, of course, incredibly unhelpful, but this gives him an idea. If the book can write on its own, maybe he can write back to it, starting a very formal letter. He politely asks the magical instruction manual for a little more clarification. He admits his little experiment was a bit dramatic. Until the book begins to respond on its own, his surprise quickly turns to utter disbelief. It writes a very formal and slightly creepy greeting. The book chides him for his sarcasm and reveals the 3 doors are not the best options. It warns him that his true choices are already fading, and signs off as the mysterious book entity. For clarity. Corin realizes he's been wasting precious time. He quickly asks the book about his brother, Tristan. The book ignores his question, telling him to focus on survival. As the room crumbles, he decides it's time to go. He remembers the book's clue about false choices, and that the doors are not the real exit. He unleashes a wave of energy from his sword, freezing the entire chasm solid. He pulls the lever, draining the water, and revealing a ladder leading into the darkness. A totally calculated move. He finds himself in a damp, icy cavern. He cautiously peers around a corner, already regretting his choice. He wonders if this new area is still part of the last trial. The book warned against the doors, so he chooses the tunnel. He reasons it's the least obvious and therefore safest path. He sprints forward past unsettling stains on the floor. Feeling confident, he pulls out his guide for the next step. Because it's been so helpful so far. But the book has a new, chilling message for him. A message that drains all the color from his face. Suddenly, an unseen force strikes him down. He finds himself in a grim chamber, surrounded by frozen figures. And in one of them, he sees a man who looks just like his brother, Tristan. He can only whisper his brother's name, but the figure before him is a stranger in a mask, a cold reflection of the man he knew. His mind flashes back to the days after Tristan disappeared, a time when his family began to fracture under the weight of grief. Soon, he was left all alone with his father, who declared that it was time to forget about his lost son. Because that's what good parents do. But a young Corin refused to give up hope. His father's response was swift and cruel. Tristan was a failure. The memory shatters as a new voice cries out a warning, and Corin is forced back to the present, deflecting an unseen attack. The force of the blast throws Corin to the ground. He struggles to pull himself together, his mind reeling. His attention is split between the masked man and the girl who warned him. He gets a clearer look at the figure trapped in the ice, and confirms his suspicion: this man is not Tristan. The brief flicker of hope dies, replaced by a grim focus on survival. He then sees the body of another adventurer, a victim of the same trap. Corin offers a quiet apology to the fallen man. Basic dungeon etiquette. He wishes the stranger's spirit peace before turning away. Just then, the girl reappears, banging on the barrier and telling him to grab the key. He takes the blue key from the fallen man's belt. He glances at the girl, wondering why a merchant is here. The scene before him is a grim and confusing puzzle. As he reaches for the barrier, the girl cries out a warning. He sheepishly pulls his hand back. Just testing the merchandise. She explains the crystalline cells are warded and nearly unbreakable. She introduces herself as Vera, but tells him to help the child first. She then points to the masked man who's been unconscious for days. Her real concern is for the small child trapped in another cell. Vera warns him the key is a one-time use item. Corin holds the blue key, realizing it doesn't match any of the locks. He reasons this must be part of the trial, a chance to free someone. He asks the 2 conscious prisoners if they've ever met his brother, Tristan. Both Vera and the masked man deny ever hearing the name. The masked man adds that while others have passed through, none were named Tristan. Vera quickly warns Corin that the masked man is a wanted criminal. She then makes her own pitch, promising to be a much more useful ally. A classic business proposal. But Corin is lost in thought, ignoring her completely. He walks right past her cell, much to her frustration. He stands before the masked man, asking why he isn't trying to argue his case. Vera quickly interjects, offering to explain the situation for the silent man. She says some of the tower's traps are mercifully fatal, while others are designed to imprison those who trigger them. Corin realizes she's a delver, a treasure hunter who entered the tower illegally. He sizes up his choices: a looter with a sales pitch, a wanted criminal, and a child who might not survive much longer. But this grim scene gives him a flicker of hope for his brother's survival. Vera pleads her case, convinced the masked man will kill her if freed. Typical roommate drama. Korin ignores them both, trying to understand the logic of the test. He consults his book, weighing the child's life against his other choices. The book gives him a stark warning: leave immediately. It tells him not to trust anyone in the cells. So heeding the book's advice, he begins to walk away. Because talking books are always trustworthy. Vera's desperate cries make him hesitate at the exit. The thought of leaving the child behind tears at him. He looks back at the grim scene of despair. He struggles with the cold logic of the tower's test, and wonders if this was the fate his brother suffered. He questions if the goddess would truly be so cruel, and in that moment he makes a choice. Korin's eyes harden with newfound determination. He questions the cruelty of the goddess's test. Turning back to the cells, he announces he has a plan, and if it works, it's going to free all of them. He tells the two conscious prisoners he'll need their cooperation. He holds up the single blue key, declaring his confidence. Vera is quick to point out the obvious flaw in his math. 1 key, 3 prisoners. But Korin just smiles, pulling out the red key from the chess room. The prisoners can only stare, wondering what other tricks he has up his sleeve. He examines a lock, theorizing the neutral color might accept any key. He asks if using the wrong key will trigger a deadly failsafe. The masked man explains the trap is designed to kill the prisoner, not the jailer. So Korin starts with the one thing he's sure of. The barrier shatters, freeing the small child from his prison. He warily checks if it's a trap, much to Vera's amusement. A healthy dose of paranoia is key to survival. The masked man points out that caution is exactly what they lacked. Korin decides to just lasso the kid out, earning a protest from Vera. She pleads with him to at least be gentle with the child. Her sudden concern piques Korin's interest. He carefully pulls the unconscious child to safety. He gently holds the child, whispering for them to hang on. Korin then turns to the masked man with a risky proposition. The man listens with a cold, unreadable expression. Vera quickly tries to dissuade him, reminding him of the man's criminal record. Korin asks the man directly if she's telling the truth. He admits he's a wanted man, but his crime was simply heresy. Korin weighs the risk against the potential of a powerful ally. He asks if they're both willing, and the masked man agrees without hesitation. With the deal struck, Korin inserts the red key into Vera's lock. But to his surprise, absolutely nothing happens. Korin's grand plan ends with a disappointing thud. But he pulls out one last option: the golden key from the first room. He inserts the key he'd chosen to leave behind, and this time, the barrier shatters in a shower of light. Vera thanks him with a hug that clearly violates his personal space. He quickly pushes her away, establishing some firm boundaries. Just then, the masked man's cell shatters on its own, and the entire chamber begins to rumble and collapse. The masked man appears, urging them to escape immediately. Korin can only stare in shock at his newly freed and very intimidating ally. Korin is stunned, realizing he never even saw the man draw a weapon. Vera reminds him she said the man was dangerous, not just wanted. As they escape, she admits she doesn't know his crime, only that he's powerful. She suspects he's not a delver, but a climber. Korin realizes this means he's aiming for the tower's peak. He wonders what a man like that could possibly want from the goddess. The masked man stops before a door, saying there's only one thing. He then punches the unlocked door into oblivion, for dramatic effect. But Vera suddenly cries out a warning. A massive stone disc plummets down towards them. The masked man unleashes a flurry of strikes, shattering the trap in an instant. Korin is stunned by his speed, realizing the man's power is beyond anything he's ever seen. He asks Vera if she could fight him, but she quickly dismisses the idea. Self-preservation is a virtue. The masked man warns that the tower dislikes it when you break the rules. Vera explains the tower might be sentient, with its layout constantly changing. The idea of multiple entries gives Korin pause. Vera teases him for being a scholar, then tells him to hurry up. With one last look back, Korin follows them into the unknown. They emerge into a stunningly beautiful hall, a stark contrast to the dangers they just faced. It looks more like a palace than a dungeon, as the masked man tends to the child. But the moment of peace is shattered, as the entire chamber begins to shake. While Korin panics, the masked man seems to have been expecting this. At the far end of the hall, a new figure appears. A powerful warrior clad in golden armor. The masked man identifies him as a visage, one of the tower's elite guardians, and the visage makes it clear they are not welcome here. He descends with angelic wings, offering them one chance to leave. Standard customer service. Korin and Vera quickly hide behind a pillar. She urges him to move, but our boy is a little preoccupied. The visage unleashes a terrifying aura, and the masked man confirms that this new foe is more than capable of ending them all. Vera tells Corin this is not the time to play the hero. He agrees, recalling that visages are powerful enough to destroy entire nations. He remembers the story of a single visage annihilating a country in one night. A slight overreaction. But the masked man steps forward, calmly asking the visage to watch his step. The Guardian responds by charging a blast of pure energy. He unleashes it without a moment's hesitation. The attack slams into the masked man, shattering a crystalline barrier. Corin and Vera can only watch in horror. The visage stares down his opponent, unimpressed. But Corin and Vera are stunned that their new ally is still standing. The masked man calmly brushes himself off, asking for a moment to talk. The visage is stunned he's unharmed, but Karis calls it a trade secret. The Golden Guardian demands to know why he has trespassed. Karas explains he only wants to deliver a message to the goddess. The visage scoffs at the audacity of his request. But Karis points out the Guardian caused most of the damage himself. He's got a point. Vera sees an opportunity to escape while the two are distracted. But she realizes with horror that the child was left behind. Corin hesitates, knowing it's a terrible idea to intervene. But he can't stand by, and sprints towards the child. He immediately drops to his knees, begging the visage for forgiveness. Corin explains he's on his judgment and has no connection to the others. The visage recognizes him as a cadence and agrees to his request. But his offer of assistance leaves Corin deeply confused. The Guardian orders him to help capture Karis. A simple team-building exercise. Corin weighs his options, knowing Karis is terrifyingly powerful. But he also knows that against a visage, they stand no chance at all. The Golden Warrior promises a swift end to the battle. Karas, however, seems to find the whole situation hilarious. The three of them are locked in a tense, silent standoff. Karas tells Vera to get Corin to safety, but the visage refuses. The Golden Guardian insists that the boy stays. The tension in the room becomes palpable, freezing everyone in place. The visage unleashes a blast, forcing Vera and Corin to dive for cover. But Karis intercepts the attack, shielding them and telling them to run. Vera clutches the child as the magical barrier shatters around them. Karas immediately closes the distance, striking the Guardian with blinding speed. The visage parries the blow, his own sword cracking the marble floor. He then summons a vortex of fire. Because a giant energy sword just wasn't enough. Karas meets the flames head-on, uttering a single word of power. A barrier of ice shields Vera and the child from the inferno, while Corin deflects the remaining flames with his own blade. The raw power on display leaves everyone stunned. Corin is the first to recover, yelling for Vera to run. He tells her they have to get out of there immediately. But the visage has already recovered, crackling with new energy. Because the fire wasn't enough. The Guardian roars in fury, unleashing a blast of purple lightning. He aims to strike down the fleeing pair from behind. But Karis is there in an instant to block the attack. He leaps forward, clashing with the Golden Guardian once more. The blast sends Karis reeling backwards. Corin can only cry out his name in shock. But Karis waves them off, ordering them to leave now. He stands, complaining that the visage almost ruined his second favorite coat. Priorities. The Guardian promises this will be over quickly, calling Karis a mere nothing. But Karis's eyes tell a very different story. He ignites his hand with fire and channels energy into his blade. A ring of spectral swords materializes around him. The visage responds in kind, his own weapon thrumming with immense power. As Vera pulls him away, Corin realizes he's caught in a battle between gods. Corin looks back, his choice made, for better or worse. The clash between the two titans echoes behind them. He questions siding with a prisoner, but quickly decides he made the right call. Vera warns that if Karis falls, the visage will be coming for them next. They find themselves in a massive arena filled with monstrous beasts. A slight upgrade from the cat bunny. And at the far end sits a Spire Guardian, another of the tower's elite protectors. Corin is already drained, having pushed his limits just to survive the last fight. Vera calmly identifies the threats ahead, from simple slimes to hulking beasts. Corin realizes these monsters are far beyond what his judgment was supposed to entail. So Vera hands him the child, telling him to stay put while she handles it. Corin reluctantly agrees, trusting Vera with their survival. Vera steps forward, her eyes fixed on the slimes above. She unleashes a powerful blast from her dueling cane, but her long-range attack barely scratches the surface. As she heads up, Corin notices something is wrong with the room. He realizes the strange marks are from hidden traps. He tries to warn her, but it's already too late. But Vera's reflexes are faster than he could have imagined. She calmly plucks the arrows from the air, a new plan forming. Recycling is important, and leaps into the fray, turning the tower's traps against it. She steps on a pressure plate, her weapon crackling with energy, and unleashes the trap's power on the nearest slime. The other monsters can only watch in gelatinous horror. She follows up by launching the stolen arrows into the crowd. Vera stands over the last one with a triumphant smirk. Corin can only watch, completely stunned by her efficiency. She tells him they're just clearing a path, not fighting the whole room. You know, because that would be crazy. With that, she leaps back into the fray and carves a path through the hulking beast in their way. She lands perfectly, ready for the next phase of their escape. But she quickly finds herself cornered by another beast. She's forced to hold it back with her cane, struggling against its immense strength. From below, Corin watches, feeling helpless against the overwhelming odds. But then he remembers an item in his bag, a spark of an idea forming. He pulls out his trusty grappling hook. You know, the one with the terrible aim. Meanwhile, Vera is still locked in a desperate struggle. Corin hurls the hook, not at a monster, but at one of the hidden traps. And this time, his aim is perfect. The trap activates, zapping one monster and giving Vera an opening. She thanks him for the assist, but Corin knows this fight is far from over. Vera points out the Spire Guardian has definitely noticed them. Corin wonders if the statue was always staring them down. A sudden ominous hum confirms his fears. With the immediate threats gone, Vera leaps back down to join him. She explains they can now backtrack through the cleared rooms. Corin offers to move the child, noticing Vera's strange concern. Vera questions his readiness for a fight of this scale, but Corin insists, puffing his chest out with family pride. You know, the same family that calls him pathetic. Vera assesses the Guardian, noting its tough exterior. Corin's eyes fall on a glowing sword, a potential key to their problem. Vera examines the sword, confident she can break the thick ice. Corin considers consulting his book, but he's wary of revealing it to Vera. His thoughts are cut short by a sudden discharge of energy. He's accidentally fired a blast from his sword, and Vera is not amused. You know, friendly fire isn't friendly. A piercing shriek fills the chamber, forcing them both to their knees. The Spire Guardian roars in fury, charging them down. Vera shouts a single unfamiliar word at Corin. He tells her to hit the pillar, but she reminds him she's not equipped for that. She's a little busy trying to block the Guardian's attack. The impact shatters her defense, but also frees the frozen sword from its prison. Vera grabs the freed sword, its blade crackling with energy. She swings it with a powerful, determined strike. But the Guardian continues its relentless advance. Corin admits Vera is impressive, but knows he has to get the other sword. He decides to use his body as a battering ram. You know, a totally sound plan, and shatters the remaining ice with a painful crash. He's left shivering on the ground, the sword finally within reach. Just as the Guardian brings its massive blade down upon him. His eyes widen as he grabs the frozen hilt, and raises the heavy weapon to meet the attack. Vera calls out, impressed by his sudden show of strength. Corin smirks, admitting he knows his way around a sword fight. But he complains that the weapon is a rusted piece of junk. You know, a craftsman is only as good as his tools. The Guardian recovers, looming over him for a final strike. Corin grits his teeth and parries the massive blow. He follows up with a swift kick to the Guardian's leg. The massive statue topples, crashing to the ground. Corin stands over his foe, ready to end the fight. But in that moment, his resolve shatters. He hesitates, the sword trembling as he fights his own nature. But Vera steps in, shattering the Guardian's head with a single decisive blow. The massive stone body crumbles into a pile of rubble. Corin collapses to the floor, utterly spent but relieved they survived. Vera, on the other hand, seems to have enjoyed the thrill of the fight. She even compliments Corin on his performance for a scholar. He lets her keep the sword, admitting she earned it. But Vera is more interested in the spoils of their victory. You know, a delver's gotta delve. Corin, ever cautious, decides not to risk triggering more traps for a few gems. He steps through the exit portal, ready to leave this room behind, only to find himself in another dark chamber, with a new trial already waiting. He sees a familiar door, framed by jagged crystalline rock. With a surge of hope, he realizes this must be the tower's exit. Vera notices him struggling and offers to take the child. He gratefully hands the kid over, and she holds them with a gentle smile. Corin breathes a sigh of relief, believing they've finally made it. But his celebration is cut short by a blade at his throat. He turns to see Vera, her expression cold and her weapon ready. You know, so much for teamwork.
She tells him it's nothing personal, just a precaution for her friend's safety.
Corin can only raise his hands in surrender, completely blindsided. He questions her about the child, realizing her strange concern was more than just kindness. Vera dismisses his question, stating she's taking the exit alone. She warns him not to follow, hinting at a much greater purpose. As the door slams shut, Corin vows to find her again someday. But for now, he has unfinished business in the tower. He sits down trying to figure out where he is. After being betrayed and abandoned, he pulls out his trusty guide, the Book of Trials of Judgment. He admits he probably should have consulted it more often, but the pages are now filled with cryptic handwritten warnings. Suddenly, the entire chamber begins to shake and crumble around him. He wonders if the battle between Karis and the Visage has finally broken through. He decides to try writing to the book one last time, asking for help. But as the chamber continues to crumble, he gets no response. He closes the book, admitting he deserves the silent treatment. For ignoring every single warning. Suddenly, a mysterious robed figure appears from the shadows. The figure addresses him by his full name, Corin Cadence. It scolds him for making things so difficult, despite its attempts to guide him. Corin realizes he's standing before the mysterious book entity itself. The entity orders him to follow, its voice echoing from all around him. It then phases through a solid wall, beckoning him forward. Corin follows, thanking his strange new guide for the unexpected rescue. The entity warns him that this favor will come at a cost for them both. It leads him to a grand chamber, a room of attunement. A glowing fountain sits at its center, the water shimmering with power. The entity instructs him to place his sword in the pool before drinking. He hopes this will give him the strength he needs to find Tristan. He carefully lowers the blade into the sacred water. With that done, he finally takes a drink. His eyes flare with a sudden, overwhelming power. A beautiful winged figure appears before him in a flash of light. She touches his forehead, telling him to awaken. A totally normal end to a job interview. The entity informs Corin that the ritual is complete. He now wields an enchanted blade, a gift from his mysterious guide. But it warns him this is only the beginning of his troubles. Corin learns his actions have thrown him into a much larger conflict. He's given a new mission, find a woman from the Lyra's Orden. But before Corin can ask any questions, the entity turns to leave. He makes one last desperate plea for information about his brother. But the entity offers no answers, only a final somber warning. Because cryptic guides are never helpful with the important stuff. The door slams shut, leaving Corin alone with his new power and the crushing weight of his unanswered questions. He looks down, a glowing mark now etched upon his forehead, a symbol of his new power and the burden that comes with it. With his trial complete, he runs for the exit. He steps outside, finally free from the tower's grasp, and is immediately greeted by 2 guards from the camp below. They congratulate him, but their cryptic warning is less than reassuring. All around him, other families celebrate their own reunions. But Corin skips the party, heading straight for the paperwork. Fun was never on the agenda. He learns his prize is 2 years of mandatory service at an academy, and his new professor is already looking forward to his arrival. Corin admits he hasn't even seen his new attunement yet. The official recognizes his name, confirming he's from House Cadence, but she delivers the news with a look of pity on her face. He reflects on her words as he travels to the academy. The verdict? His new power is virtually useless, a great reward for almost dying. He arrives at the academy, a grand and imposing estate, but a familiar figure is already waiting for him inside. His father declares that he has failed, just as he always expected. The words hit Corin harder than any monster in the tower. With one last look of disdain, his father turns away. Corin knows every conversation with his father is a duel. He refuses to overreact, seeing this as a small victory. But his father immediately dismisses it as a coward's mark. Corin steels himself, refusing to take the bait. His father then reveals he has found a replacement. Just what every son wants to hear. Footsteps echo from the doorway behind him. A familiar face appears, his childhood rival, Sarah. And she asks if she should call him brother now. Corin is stunned, realizing his replacement is his own retainer. But as he looks closer, he sees an undeniable family resemblance. His father clarifies that while Sarah is now a Cadence, she has yet to earn the right to call him father. Corin stands between them, silently recalling just how pretentious his rival has always been. His father twists the knife, revealing Sarah has a rare and powerful summoner attunement. He pats her on the head, declaring her the new hope for their family's legacy, and tells Corin to follow her lead if he ever wants to amount to anything. Just then, a new figure arrives, congratulating Sarah on her achievement. Corin brushes off the man's concern, casually mentioning he learned valuable information in the tower. His father stops him, questioning how he could remember anything from his trial. Corin smirks, revealing he took notes and that he's no longer competing for his father's approval. A major character development moment. Magnus scoffs, asking if the notes are just a guide on how to run away. Magnus materializes a large monster crystal, trying to impress Sarah. Corin retorts that his new sword is far more impressive, but his father just raises the stakes for Sarah's next trial. Corin declares the whole display exhausting and walks away. He turns back with a smile, welcoming Sarah back into his life. The gesture seems to catch her off guard, but his father is unmoved. As night falls over the grand estate, a new day brings a new set of challenges. Corin's mind drifts back to a simpler time. A memory of his brother Tristan always there to lift him up. A memory of the only hand that ever reached out to help him. 3 days later, Corin is already buried in research. But the family library is useless for his new enchanting abilities. Their legacy was built on combat, not on crafting. You know, a very subtle family. Deciding to head out, his studies are interrupted by a sudden blur. A familiar figure zips past him in a flash of blue energy. He comes face to face with his new sister, Sarah. The two of them stand in a tense, awkward silence. She tells him to study hard if he wants to keep up. But Corin just tells her to button her coat, a hint of a smile on his face. Sarah's voice cuts through his thoughts. They stand in silence, a new dynamic between them. She teases him about his appearance, a smug look on her face. You know, classic sibling rivalry. But her grand speech is ruined by a sudden sneeze. Later, Corin walks the academy grounds, lost in his studies. He overhears talk of another climber lost to the tower. The news brings back memories of the prison cells and a flicker of hope for Tristan. He reaffirms his goal, to grow strong enough to conquer the spire, and to ask the goddess herself to return his brother. A week later, on a train to the academy, he decides to test a theory. He writes a very formal letter to his mysterious book entity. But his strange behavior catches the eye of a fellow passenger. She asks about his book, and he plays it off as magical. He then gives a grand explanation about its connection to the tower. The girl, however, is not so easily convinced. So he gives her a very specific and very suspicious percentage of truth. You know, for scientific accuracy. A moment of silence hangs between the two of them, before they both burst into laughter, breaking the tension. He decides to tell her the real story, starting from the beginning. And their journey to Lorien Heights Academy continues. Sarah teases him about his loss in the chess room. She chides him for overthinking every single strategy, and tells him he needs to learn to just take action. But she points out his risky plan almost got him killed. He reveals his prize for winning was a meeting with the God Serpent. A meeting he wisely decided to skip. You know, for health reasons. Their conversation is cut short as the train arrives at the academy. Sarah gets up to leave, eager to hear the rest of his story later. But Corin hesitates, debating whether to tell her about Karis and the visage. He decides it's too dangerous, a secret best kept to himself for now. The scene opens on Lorien Heights Academy, where a record number of new students have arrived. Corin stands among the crowd, just another face in a sea of new arrivals. A speaker begins the commencement ceremony, welcoming the promising new candidates. Students have gathered from all across the nation, and from allied countries as well, all hoping to prove their worth. A young man with a familiar glowing mark listens intently. The speaker makes it clear there will be no favoritism for local students. You know, a totally fair and unbiased system. The marked student understands the need for such a rule, given the nation's history. He sees the tension firsthand as local students glare at the newcomers, and recalls a grim story of past violence, a reminder of the hatred that still lingers here. But his thoughts are interrupted by Sarah, who tries to get his attention. She excitedly points out a familiar face in the crowd, a boy named Patrick. A cheerful young man waves enthusiastically from a distance. Corin's immediate reaction is to duck, claiming he dropped something. You know, a totally smooth move. He worries his old friend will look down on him for his weak attunement. Sarah tells him their other friends are here as well, hoping they'll be in the same classes. Corin can only manage a half-hearted agreement. She teases him for his lack of enthusiasm, but he worries his old friends have forgotten him. Sarah reminds him of his close bond with Patrick, urging him to at least look happy. He takes her words to heart, resolving to try and be more positive. The speaker explains the academy structure, 6 divisions based on attunement. Corin realizes he and Sarah will be separated. First up is Professor Saradin, head of the Offensive Tiger Division. Next is Professor Orden, leader of the Serpent Division for Reconnaissance. He immediately recognizes the name, Lyris Orden, the very woman the mysterious book entity ordered him to find. The other divisions are quickly introduced, covering defense and combat. Corin despairs, realizing he's been relegated to the support class. You know, a real combat legacy. And finally, the Spider Division, a group of infiltrators and saboteurs. The speaker drones on, much to the crowd's collective boredom. The speaker announces a new school-wide game, Find the Spy. You know, for team building. A wave of distrust immediately washes over the student body. But if a division fails to find their spy, everyone loses points, and accusing the wrong person will cost them dearly. With that, she cheerfully concludes the ceremony, wishing them luck. The students sing the Academy hymn, though one boy silently critiques the lyrics. As the faculty departs, the crowd begins to disperse. Just then, Patrick and his friends call out to Corin. But Corin turns away, claiming he has something important to do. His friends can only watch, confused by his sudden departure. He decides to avoid his friends for now, focusing on his mission. He finds the office of Professor Lyris Orden, the woman he was sent to find. Inside, the professor is already annoyed by the interruption. She recognizes his family crest and questions why he's here. Corin explains he has a private message, but she assures him the room is secure. He reveals the voice of the tower sent him, leaving the professor stunned. Suddenly, a strange message floods Corin's mind, leaving him disoriented. The professor panics, realizing the room isn't safe enough for this conversation. A slight security oversight. A voice echoes in his head, warning him that his life is in danger. She explains that knowing about the voice has likely put him on a visage's radar. The professor cuts him off with an urgent warning. She explains that this kind of attention usually ends with people disappearing. She quickly produces a small, locked chest and gives him a starter kit for survival, telling him to ward his room at night. Corin is confused, but she has no time for a detailed explanation. A great start to his academic career. She pushes him out, giving him a cover story and telling him not to die. Corin is left standing in the hall, wondering what he's just stumbled into. He puts his book away, his mind still reeling from the conversation. Later, he tries to contact the voice, but gets only silence in return. Now, every passing student is a potential threat. Corin rushes through the halls, his mind still on the professor's warning. But his frantic pace catches the eye of another student who finds him interesting. That night, back in the relative safety of the dorms, Corin takes some rather extreme measures to secure his room. A few nails should stop a visage. He rearranges his furniture and plans to sleep in his uniform just in case. He even tries to replicate the professor's protective runes, but he's still struggling to understand how to power them properly. Without the right materials, his enchantments are just pretty drawings. He turns his attention to the sword from the tower, a puzzle in itself. But just as he dismisses his own defenses, a sudden knock echoes through the room. He debates answering, reasoning that a real assassin wouldn't be so polite. But he grabs his sword anyway, just to be safe. He realizes his barricade is a bit of an inconvenience. After a moment, he calls out and begins to open the door. He peeks out to find another student waiting patiently in the hall. Corin cautiously asks the stranger for his identity. The student asks if Corin is a member of the Spider Division. Corin awkwardly denies the accusation. Because he's clearly not a spy. The stranger seems to accept his answer, glancing at the nameplate. He walks away with a smirk, finding Corin's paranoia very interesting. Corin sits on the stairs, listening to the footsteps fade away. He decides that's enough social interaction for one day. For a guy who just barricaded his door. He tries to sleep, but his mind is racing, trying to process everything. He realizes the stranger must be going door to door, asking everyone the same question. A clever tactic to catch the spy off guard, and Corin is reluctantly impressed. The next morning, he wakes up shivering, having slept with his ice sword for protection. His first class is magic theory, and he's already struggling to stay awake. Professor Meltake explains the basics of mana, drawing it from different parts of the body, but she warns that overusing mana from a single source can cause permanent damage. Corin realizes his own attunement could easily kill him, just like it did his great-grandfather. Their first assignment is to test their mana pools at the divinatory. The professor dismisses the class, eager to see their results. But as he leaves, his old friend Patrick calls out his name. Corin decides to just pretend he didn't hear him. A totally mature response. His next class takes him to an outdoor dueling arena. He knows most people would laugh at an enchanter taking a combat class, but attunement or not, he is still a cadence. And it seems Sarah had the exact same idea. He recognizes another student, Roland Royce, the son of a family retainer. The other students are already mocking him for his choice of weapons. Corin knows underestimating Roland would be a grave mistake. Just then, a student points out their professor, who's been watching them the whole time. He wastes no time asking for volunteers for the first duel. Trial by fire. The students are stunned, having had no time to train with their new powers. But two step forward, and the class begins with a sudden, chaotic spar. One of the duelists, Rupert, unleashes a powerful blast of energy. He calls out his attack, a crackling bolt of violet lightning. But his opponent, Marissa, stands firm, ready to meet the challenge. She shatters the attack with a single punch, stunning the onlookers. The professor seems to be enjoying the show a little too much, and Corin senses something is wrong. Corin notices a strange blur in the stands, a detail that matches the professor's own arrival. Meanwhile, Rupert charges forward, his body crackling with lightning. But Marissa ends the fight with a single punch, sending him flying. You know, a real one-hitter quitter. The professor applauds, declaring the match officially over. The victor introduces herself as Marissa Callahan. Lord Teft uses the duel as a lesson on the dangers of poor preparation. He then asks for new volunteers, and Roland Royce steps onto the stage. The professor seems amused by the boy's name and invites him forward. Corin watches, noting the confidence it takes to wield two dueling canes at once. He knows that in this class, everyone is a potential threat. The professor asks Roland to choose his opponent. Roland's eyes land on a familiar face in the crowd, Corin. Corin groans, his plan to stay hidden completely ruined. He decides to offer an old signal for a truce, a relic from their childhood games. But Roland just stares back, completely unimpressed. He dismisses the offer with a simple wave of his hand and points directly at Corin, declaring him the ideal opponent. You know, because everyone loves an easy target. Corin facepalms, realizing he's the perfect strategic choice for a first-day victory. With the challenge accepted, the professor calls Corin to the stage. But Corin hesitates, his eyes fixed on the professor's own attunement. The professor immediately questions why an enchanter is in his class. Corin had hoped for impartiality, but the cultural bias is strong. He tries to argue his case, but the professor dismisses him without a second thought. He gives Corin a final warning, telling him to leave now. But Corin clenches his fist, refusing to be pushed around. He stands his ground, declaring he has a right to be here. The professor sighs, deciding to offer a different kind of test. If Corin can last 10 seconds against him, he can stay. You know, a totally reasonable entrance exam. The professor unleashes a terrifying wave of energy, ready to begin, and fires a blast that shatters the wall beside Corin's head. The other students scramble for cover, shouting in panic. The blast obliterates the wall where Corin was just standing. The professor begins his countdown, unimpressed by the collateral damage. Corin frantically searches for his weapon in the chaos. He spots his dueling cane lying among the shattered stones. But the professor's attention is drawn to another student stepping forward. Roland Royce draws his own dueling canes, ready to intervene. He unleashes a powerful blast of crackling blue energy. The attack intercepts the professor's canes, stopping him cold. You know, because this class needed more drama, just as another student leaps into the air, calling on the goddess for aid. A third student unleashes a storm of ice shards at the professor, who responds with a massive wall of swirling fire. Corin can only stare in awe as Sarah screams for him to run. The two elemental attacks collide in a chaotic explosion. Patrick signals for Corin to get out of there, while he has the chance. Corin snaps back to reality, his survival instincts kicking in. He sprints away, trying to outlast the professor's countdown. You know, a totally fair test of his abilities. But the professor appears before him, grabbing his cane with a mocking grin. Corin is stunned, wondering if the man just teleported from the stage. He glances back at the explosions, but the professor warns him to keep his eyes on his opponent. The professor pins Corin's weapon to the ground with his own. Corin complains that the test isn't fair as the countdown continues. The professor scoffs, telling him that fairness has no place in battle. But Corin rises to his feet, declaring he's done running away. The professor seems amused by this sudden show of defiance. Corin charges forward, swinging his cane with everything he has. But the professor blocks it with ease. Surprised, Corin didn't try to dodge. He flicks the cane away, calling it an unwise move. Corin uses the opening to remind the professor of his own lesson. You know, the one about not looking away from your opponent. He now holds his enchanted sword, continuing the countdown with a confident smirk. The professor blocks the enchanted blade, surprised by its power. Corin ducks under a swift counterattack. He parries again, but the professor notes he's moving slower now. Their weapons clash, crackling with a mix of ice and lightning. Corin follows up with a swift kick to the man's chest. The move catches the professor off guard, forcing him back. He looks down, intrigued by the frost now coating his weapon. Corin points out that the 10-second countdown is long over. You know, basic math. The professor ignites his cane, offering to call the count at 5. He asks if Corin can concentrate with so many distractions. Corin parries another blow, laying out his theory. He explains he saw an invisible figure in the stands, and that the professor is either a fake or has an accomplice. He points out the professor on stage was much faster than the one he's fighting now, and that his divided attention just led him into a trap. You know, a classic rookie mistake. Korin lunges, declaring one of them must be a projection. The professor dodges, admitting Korin is close to the truth. But our boy presses the attack, confident he's figured it out. The professor confirms he's a simulacrum, but denies being any slower, and proves it by kicking Korin in the head as the countdown continues. The simulacrum lands a solid blow, continuing his countdown. He explains he let Korin get close just to see what he was capable of. The professor then asks if our boy has any other brilliant insights to share. But Korin just gets to his feet, declaring he has nothing more to say. The professor finally relents, admitting Korin has lasted his 10 seconds. Korin thanks the fake professor, who reminds him he was still beaten by a construct. With a sigh of relief, Korin decides it's time to rejoin the class. The real professor appears on stage, praising the students' unexpected tactics. He explains that since this wasn't an official duel, no one will be penalized for ganging up on him. You know, a convenient loophole. He tells Korin he's lucky to have such loyal friends, who were willing to attack a teacher for him. He even awards points to the 3 students who jumped in to help. With the test over, the professor begins the actual lesson on simulacra. As the sun sets, Korin finally leaves the dueling grounds. He reflects on the chaos of his first day, but his thoughts are cut short. He turns to see his friends rushing to catch up with him. They finally reach him, teasing him about the mess he just survived. Korin deflects, blaming Roland for starting it, but thanks them for the save. Patrick laughs, recalling the look of terror on Korin's face. You know, for moral support. Korin finally smiles, happy to be reunited with his old friend. The group decides to head to the dining hall to celebrate their victory. Korin admits he wouldn't have survived the professor's test without them. He realizes that if he's going to make it, he has to let people in. But at dinner, his paranoia returns, convinced the good food is a trap. Sarah tells him to relax, but Patrick encourages his suspicious nature. They all agree their new professor is a dangerous narcissist. You know, a great role model. Korin then asks Sarah about the powerful ice spell she used. She casually reveals it was a rank 4 spell, drawn from a contract. The revelation makes Korin realize just how rusty he's become. The conversation then turns to Korin's own enchanted sword. Patrick is immediately jealous, gushing over the magical weapon. Sarah shuts Patrick down, reminding him Korin knows his own family's legacy. Roland mentions his parents still serve Korin's mother as retainers. The comment makes Korin realize how long it's been since he's written home. Sarah changed the subject, mentioning 2 seemingly unrelated articles in the paper. One about troop movements and the other about a visage who's been missing meetings. The news makes Korin choke, which he quickly blames on his food. You know, a totally believable excuse. He tries to play it cool, asking if the paper mentioned which visage it was. The missing guardian is Tenjin, the very same one he saw Karas fighting in the tower. The revelation is too much, and Korin makes a clumsy excuse to leave the table. He rushes off, leaving his confused friends to wonder what's wrong. But Sarah isn't about to let him get away that easily. She chases after him, calling his name down the empty hall. She confronts him, knowing his dramatic exit means he's hiding something. He tries to blame it on a potato, but she knows he's a terrible liar. She offers to help, but Korin can't bring himself to tell her the truth. Sarah leaves him with a promise to ask again, giving him no way out. But he knows he can't involve her, deciding this is a burden he must carry alone. He rushes back to his room, his mind connecting the dots. The visage he fought wasn't Tenjin, but another guardian entirely, adding a potential invasion to his list of worries. A voice calls out his name, and his first thought is assassins. You know, a perfectly reasonable assumption at this point, but it's not an assassin, just 2 other students at his door. The larger one introduces himself as the dorm chief, Curtis. The other student, the spy hunter from last night, plays coy about their meeting. A 3rd student joins the conversation, accusing the spy hunter of his late-night interrogations. Curtis ignores them, inviting Korin to a dorm meeting he'd skipped. Korin immediately tries to think of an excuse to get out of it. You know, because people are scary. But Curtis tempts him with the promise of free snacks. Korin's eyes widen, but not because of the food. He points to a mark on Curtis's arm, asking how he has a second attunement. Curtis just flexes, using the mystery as bait to get Korin to the meeting. Korin decides the potential knowledge is worth the social agony and agrees to go. He finds himself in a circle of students, already regretting his decision as one of them introduces himself. After a painfully awkward introduction, Curtis calls on Korin to take his turn. Korin keeps it short and sweet, stating his name and his less than impressive attunement. Curtis moves on to the final student, while the spy hunter complains about the lack of promised snacks. Priorities. The last boy, Jin, offers a simple and polite greeting to the group. The spy hunter immediately grows suspicious, questioning why Jin gave no family name or attunement. He makes a sarcastic remark about the missing cake, clearly unimpressed. The spy hunter then explains the real reason for the meeting, a mandatory team-up later in the year. Curtis boasts about his own team's success, revealing their final exam is a return to the tower, much to Corin's horror. Curtis tells them to get to know each other. His words seem to resonate with Corin. Because you never know who you'll need to survive. Later at the divinatory, it's time for their mana examinations. An examiner begins the test, chanting a simple spell, and after a moment he confirms the results. But the news he delivers is far from good. His attunement mark is in a terrible spot for an enchanter. Just adding insult to injury. His sword hand has decent mana, but he's already overusing it. He learns that without proper care, he could permanently damage himself. The examiner explains that any damage will permanently stunt his growth. He's handed a list of his safe mana limits, a grim report card of his own weakness. Corin can only thank his father for the years of brutal training that led to this. A real chip off the old block. But his real problem is the attunement on his forehead. Using it means risking the same fate as his great-grandfather, a war hero who lost his mind. He's seen the fear of that legacy passed down through generations, a curse on their family name. He knows he has to push past that fear to get stronger, but he just can't. The weight of his family's expectations is a shadow he can't seem to outrun. As night falls over the academy, Corin gets to work trying to find another way forward. Corin finds himself overwhelmed by homework, a different kind of trial. Just then, a shadow falls across his floor, and his door explodes in a shower of fire and splinters. A mysterious cloaked figure steps through the wreckage. Corin realizes he should be more careful what he wishes for. The goddess has a dark sense of humor. The assassin lunges, but Corin scrambles for his dueling cane. He barely manages to block the strange, crackling blade. Pushing back, he unleashes a blast of pure energy. But the attack does nothing, absorbed by the figure's strange tunic. He realizes the room is warded as his opponent charges again. He realizes that if the room is warded, he might be able to get someone's attention from outside. He fires a blast at the ceiling, hoping to draw help, but his cry is cut short by a swift kick to the face. The blow sends him flying across the room. He realizes his opponent has an attunement that enhances their physical strength. He wishes he had his enchanted sword, but it's out of reach. So he makes do with his cane and a bedsheet for a cloak, for that dramatic flair. With renewed resolve, he prepares to strike, but his grand entrance is ruined when he trips on his own makeshift cape. The assassin can only stare as Corin lands in a heap on the floor. With our boy defenseless, the attacker lunges with a glowing blade, but a shield sigil on his uniform flares to life, blocking the blow. A small enchanted pin he'd prepared just in case. Corin uses the opening to land a desperate punch. The assassin stumbles back, pulling out a strange vial, and tosses the object directly at Corin, who catches it, completely baffled by the move. He realizes it was a distraction as the assassin vanishes, only to reappear behind him, a blade pressed to his throat. The assassin holds him fast, a blade pressed against his skin. But just as he's about to be silenced, a new voice cuts through the chaos. It's Jin, the quiet boy from the dorm meeting, now armed and ready. The assassin seems impressed, complimenting Corin's quick thinking, and with a single command, the illusion shatters, revealing none other than Professor Orden herself. Just a standard pop quiz. Corin can only stare, realizing the entire attack was just another test. She reminds him that she did warn him to be prepared, but Jin isn't lowering his weapon just yet. He asks Corin if this was the kind of threat he was expecting. Corin explains his theory that this might not be the real professor. He runs through the logic, realizing there's no easy way to be sure. The professor seems to enjoy his paranoia, offering to prove her identity, but her demonstration is cut short by a blast from the doorway. Jin stands firm, telling the professor that it's time for her to leave. She orders Corin to her office, and he agrees. If she's the real one. Just to be difficult. With a final, condescending remark, she turns to make her exit. But Jin dispels the illusion with a simple snap of his fingers. Corin can only remark on her overly dramatic departure. Jin picks up the vial she left, suggesting she might be a villain after all. Jin remarks that the professor's methods were a little strange. He then ignores Corin's protests and picks up his enchanted sword. He examines the blade, intrigued by its power. Personal space is optional. He then asks Corin the same question from the night before. Corin denies it again, just wanting his sword back. Jin seems satisfied with his answer, a smirk on his face. He calls Korin an intriguing person, much to our boy's surprise. He asks why he wouldn't remember the name of his new dorm mate. An awkward silence hangs between the two of them. Korin thanks him for the help, but Jin says he owes him twice. Korin questions why he owes Jin 2 favors. Jin simply points to the hole Korin blasted in his own ceiling. Just then, a piece of furniture crashes down from the room above. A room that, as it turns out, belonged to Jin. Awkward roommate introductions. As they walk, Jin asks why assassins are after Korin. Korin tries to play it off, blaming the professor's paranoia. But Jin presses for a real answer, and Korin asks for a moment to think. He weighs the risk of telling his secret against the danger of hiding it. He decides to tell Jin a part of the truth, warning him of the danger. But Jin seems completely unfazed, ready to hear the whole story. He explains he saw things in the tower he shouldn't have, and that Professor Orden warned him to prepare for an attack. Jin agrees her methods were extreme, but her goal was clear. He tells Korin that if this was a test, then our boy passed with flying colors. Their next stop is the girls' dorm, where a familiar face answers the door. Korin asks Sarah if they can come in, much to Jin's annoyance. She sarcastically remarks that her prayers have been answered. In the worst way possible. Korin admits they need a place to stay for the night. When she asks why, he gives her a one-word answer. Assassins. Sarah repeats the word, her expression dripping with disbelief. Korin quickly corrects himself, admitting it was only one. She sighs, telling them they can sleep on the floor for now. A 5-star accommodation. An awkward silence falls between the two boys. Sarah suggests sending Jin to Patrick's room instead. Their late-night planning earns them a few angry shouts from other students. The next morning, Sarah wakes up with a long yawn. She turns to greet Korin, only to find the room completely empty. Korin can only sigh, already done with the day. Korin closes his eyes, trying to focus. He arrives at Professor Orden's office, ready for answers. But before he can knock, he's yanked inside. The professor confirms she was his late-night visitor and that they need to leave immediately. She begins a complex teleportation spell, a circle of light engulfing them both. Korin tries to protest, but it's already too late. Consent is optional in a crisis, and in a flash of blue light, they vanish from the room. The professor tells him to get a grip as they reappear. He lands hard, asking if this is a safe house or her personal murder dungeon. She just smiles, ready to finally explain what's going on. She sits upon a conjured throne, ready to begin their little chat. Korin's mind races, trying to analyze her power and prepare for what's next. She explains the attack was a test of his creativity under pressure. Korin retorts that her methods were a bit extreme for a simple pop quiz. She holds up the strange blade that nearly ended him, only to reveal it was just a carrot all along. A perfectly normal teaching tool. She laughs at his concern, revealing her defenses are far beyond his current level. Korin admits his formal education on attunements is a little rusty, so she gives him a quick lesson on the power rankings, confirming he's at the very bottom, and that her own enchanted gear was made by a master of the craft. She reveals she's been watching him, even noting Sarah's impressive power. She explains it was to verify his identity, since spies have been sent to the academy before. With his identity confirmed, she gets to the real reason for their meeting. After hearing his entire story, her only response is a single cryptic comment. She says his tale changes everything, and that she needs to investigate further. She then reveals a chilling fact. No one has left the tower since he did. Even high-level climbers have vanished, leading her to believe the tower is trapping someone inside. Korin nervously asks for more information about the man he freed. She describes Karis as a dangerous heretic, an agent of a golden tyrant. Korin realizes he may have just unleashed a demigod. A minor oopsie. The professor tells him he has potential, but sets a new goal. He has 3 months to reach the Carnelian level, or he's in deep trouble. Korin nervously asks if he's supposed to be training to fight a demigod. She bluntly tells him that if Kiris attacks, he should just be prepared to die. Great advice. He's ordered to keep this a secret from everyone, even Sarah. With that, she teleports him back to the academy grounds. Korin walks alone, the weight of his actions crushing him. But his brooding is cut short by a furious Sarah running towards him. She gets right in his face, demanding to know where he's been. He tries to play it off as another test, but she's not buying it for a second. Sarah tells him to let them know when he's ready to trust them. She walks away, leaving Patrick to follow. Korin is left alone with the weight of his secrets. As another day ends at the academy, he resolves to keep his friends out of this mess. But a strange noise suddenly breaks the silence. He finds Jin already in his room, making himself at home. Because knocking is for amateurs. Jin asks if he's ready to share what he learned. He reminds Korin of the favor he's owed. So Korin finally explains everything he knows. Jin explains he's trying to learn about a tournament his father avoids mentioning. Korin suggests they could find a memory crystal of someone who was there. Jin insists on going alone and asks to borrow some of Korin's clothes. He emerges in a disguise that Korin suspects is just an excuse to play dress-up. For tactical espionage. He tells Korin to wait, promising he won't be gone for long. And with that, he heads out, leaving Korin to wait for his return. 2 hours later, Korin is starting to seriously regret this whole arrangement. Suddenly, a green crystal drops down from the hole in his ceiling. Jin appears from above, explaining how to use the memory crystal he's brought back. He tells Korin this is payback for trusting him, a favor returned before he leaves for the night. Korin holds the memory crystal, a key to the past. He examines the strange artifact with a curious smile. Lying in bed, he activates the crystal, ready to see its secrets. His eyes snap open, and he's pulled into another's mind. He finds himself in a grand hall he's never seen before. He recognizes the Valian flag hanging on the wall, and banners depicting the visages, Tenjin and Kerivas. But as he tries to explore, he realizes he can't move. He struggles against the invisible force holding him in place. Because being a ghost is harder than it looks. He realizes he's just an observer, a passenger in someone else's memory. He sees the world through the eyes of a blonde man and feels the man's anxiety as if it were his own. He decides to just go with the flow of the memory. An older man instructs his companion to watch closely, just as 3 figures are escorted into the hall, a masked prisoner flanked by 2 armed guards. The blonde man holds his ground, stopping any attempt to intervene. He's told his only job is to be a witness. A totally relaxing spectator sport. The man's eyes widen, a flicker of fear in his gaze. The memory's owner realizes he's seeing the world through a diviner's eyes. He notes the guards are at the Sunstone level, as powerful as most professors. But Kiris is an anomaly, his aura colorless and seemingly tearing space itself. The older man assures his companion that they are prepared for any outcome. Suddenly, he senses a new presence entering the hall, and Korin is stunned by the familiar face he sees. The memory's owner recognizes one of the newcomers as his own mother. With everyone assembled, the older man declares the meeting can begin. Karas addresses the council, asking if he's speaking to the visaged Tenjin. The one he was just trying to kill. But a man introduces himself as Counselor Lanoy, the visage's adjutant. Karas cuts him off, clearly disappointed by the lack of a proper welcome wagon. He demands to know why the visage isn't here to meet him as promised. The memory's owner can only watch, his anxiety growing with every passing second. The counselor explains that, regrettably, such a meeting will not be possible. Their allies have declared Karis guilty of heresy and requested his immediate extradition. A guard steps forward, assuring him this isn't a trap, just a case of bad timing. Karas believes he can clear his name if he's just allowed to deliver his message. But the woman gives the counselor a silent, unyielding look. He formally places Karis under arrest, offering the services of their best legal advisors. As a courtesy, he even suggests they might be able to convince the kingdom to lower his sentence. Karas bursts into laughter, sarcastically asking if they'll only take half his head off. Karas just smiles, saying he has no intention of dying for telling the truth. The memory's owner wonders what truth he could possibly mean. With that, Karis announces he'll be leaving now. He asks them to let him go peacefully, but the guards have other ideas. Because peacefully is never an option. The counselor orders him bound with magical chains, certain he won't escape. The woman orders the guards to seize him immediately. Karas looks down, admitting that was a mistake on their part. With a single flex, he shatters the chains of light. A guard lunges forward, his sword raised to strike. But Karis meets the blade with his bare fist, shattering it instantly. He follows up with a single punch that sends the guard flying. The older man holds his companion back, reminding him to just watch. The second guard lunges, but Karis dodges the attack with ease. Just as 2 sorcerers unleash a storm of ice and lightning, the memory's owner cries out for his mother as Karis stands amidst the chaos, almost flattered by the attention. A third sorcerer appears, correcting him on their numbers and suggesting he surrender. But Karis isn't complaining, saying the fight is just getting interesting. He takes a fighting stance, daring any of them to make the first move. The sorceress scoffs, pointing out that he's unarmed and poses no real threat. Karas tells her to hold that thought, a new plan already forming. He disarms one of the guards with a single fluid motion, and decides to borrow the man's sword for the occasion. He uses the pommel to strike the guard down, but the sorceress encases the man in ice, protecting him from the blow. She then unleashes a barrage of ice shards at Karis, as her companion prepares a much larger attack from the stands. The man unleashes a powerful wave of energy, but Karis seems unimpressed. He meets the blast head-on, swinging the stolen sword. The two attacks collide in a blinding explosion of light, and Karis is sent flying back into the very ice he was just mocking. You know, karma's a real thing. He pushes back against the ice, surrounded by orbs of crackling energy. The attack detonates in a massive, blinding explosion. The counselor looks down, giving Karis one final chance to surrender. But Karis just smirks, completely unfazed by the threat. As they prepare to end it, a strange power radiates from the prisoner. He moves in a blur too fast for anyone to react, and lands a single decisive kick on the counselor. With the man down, Karis calmly asks who's next. You know, like he's ordering at a cafe. The sorceress responds by beginning a powerful summoning ritual. The entire hall begins to rumble as a new power enters the fray. She summons a massive armored golem, ordering it to seize him. But Karis just turns to face his new opponent, completely unfazed. He meets the construct head-on, shattering its arm with a single punch. He then leaps over the older man, who insists he's just a spectator. Karas agrees, a confident smirk on his face. The sorceress calls his move predictable, raising a wall of ice. She sends the frozen barrier crashing down, trapping him inside. The golem looms over him, ready to deliver the final blow, and brings its fist down in a massive, icy explosion. The sorceress celebrates her victory, convinced they've finally won. You know, because that always works out. The golem brings its massive fist down, stomping with the full weight of its power. But Karis catches the blow with a single hand, admitting it actually stung a little. With a single blinding slash, he dismantles the entire construct in an instant. The sorceress tries to dismiss her summon, but it's far too late. Karas now holds a blade to her throat. She quickly concedes, promising to withdraw from the fight. You know, a wise career move. But just as one opponent falls, another's power erupts around him. Karas turns to face the flames, apologizing for the delay. The woman agrees to the duel, ready to face him. The memory's owner worries for his mother, knowing Karis is a true monster. He wonders what became of her after this fight 5 years ago. She blocks Karis's blade, surprised by his speed. She kicks him back and introduces herself as Laura Lyron, and declares herself an emerald swordmaster. You know, for the dramatic flair. Karas is intrigued, challenging her to match his own speed. He unleashes a flurry of blades, but she parries every single one. Their swords clash, crackling with immense power. The impact shreds Karis's shirt, and he questions why her defenses are failing. Karas agrees with her assessment, promising to explain later. But first, he lands a solid punch to her face. You know, a real gentleman. The two warriors clash again, their blades crackling with energy. He notes her new strategy, but she's unimpressed by his electrified blade. He admits his dislike for lightning, but she offers to change his mind. She decides the time for talking is over. Just then, a downed guard grabs his leg, creating an opening. Laura seizes the opportunity, her sword thrumming with immense power. She plunges the blade through his chest, declaring the fight is over. The memory's owner can only watch in shock, believing his mother has won. Karas grits his teeth as the blade pierces his chest. The guard holds on, creating the opening Laura needed. She stands over him, offering one last chance to surrender. But Karis just smiles, complimenting her clever strategy. He admits the guard's valiant effort was unexpected. He rises, warning her that he still has a few tricks left. You know, because a little stab wound is just a flesh wound. From the stands, the memory's owner senses something is wrong. He realizes his mother is fighting as if she's at a disadvantage. Laura unleashes a massive downward strike of pure lightning, but Karis catches the entire blast with his bare hand. Laura is stunned, wondering how he could have possibly dodged that. Their blades clash again in a shower of sparks. He grits his teeth, pouring all his strength into the blow, and the stolen sword finally shatters under the pressure. Laura stands over the broken blade, thinking she's won, but Karis asks if they can finally end this little warm-up. He unleashes a flurry of afterimages, a blur of motion. Laura uses the downed guard as a springboard, you know, for a tactical advantage. Karas can only watch, impressed by her resourcefulness, and lands a powerful, crackling punch to his chest. Karas grits his teeth, taking the full force of the blow. Laura lands gracefully on her feet after the attack, but she realizes he's used some kind of teleportation trick, and has somehow stolen her shoes in the process. You know, for the ultimate power move. He unleashes a wave of dark energy, his true power finally revealed. He thanks the council for the entertaining fight, and with a few swift slashes, he carves an escape route through the wall, hoping they'll meet again. But Laura refuses to let him just walk away. She unleashes a final, desperate blast of lightning as he makes his escape. Laura braces herself against the force of the blast. The explosion tears through the hall, leaving a path of destruction. One of the sorceresses tries to give chase, but is told to stay and help the wounded. She reluctantly agrees, her face pale with shock. From the stands, the memory's owner and his companion watch the aftermath. The counselor and his guards are left unconscious on the floor. The entire chamber is in ruins. A totally normal diplomatic meeting. The older man is chided for letting Karis escape, but he seems unconcerned. The blonde man rushes to the fallen, relieved to find them still breathing. But the sorceress knows this wasn't luck. Karis chose to let them live. The memory's owner can only watch, his face pale with shock. He now knows the woman who fought Karis was his own mother, but the memory fades before he can get any answers. Corin snaps back to reality, gasping for air. He pieces it all together. The ambush, the missing visage, and his own mother's mysterious involvement in the incident. He realizes it's been far too long since he's contacted her. So he sits down to write a letter asking about Karis and sends it off via messenger bird. The original instant message, but he knows there's someone else he needs to talk to right away. He returns to Professor Orden's office, telling her he has urgent news. She prepares to teleport them again, much to Corin's dismay. Because magical travel sickness is a real thing. But a sudden gust of wind fills the room as a powerful spell activates. The force throws them against the door, and Corin wonders if this is another test. But the professor's panic is real as she tells him they have to run. He looks outside, his eyes widening in disbelief. A monstrous purple beast descends from the sky. It's a colossal dragon, its shadow falling over the panicked students below. A voice from the crowd identifies the beast as Mizuchi, the hero's end. Corin recognizes the name as the dragon crashes into the academy grounds. A student raises a barrier, protecting his classmates from the falling debris. Corin asks if this is just a drill, but the professor confirms the threat is very real. All around them, other monsters have already begun their assault, and they don't look like they're here for a friendly chat. The students scatter in terror as the sky fills with winged beasts. Professor Orden tries to keep Corin calm, telling him to get to the nearest shelter. Just then, another professor arrives with his own group of students. She asks the man to take Corin with them to safety. She tells our boy to run along while she handles the giant dragon. A totally normal day for a teacher. And it seems his friends have already found him in the chaos. Professor Orden brushes off a request to call for backup. Patrick, however, seems to be enjoying the chaos a little too much. Corin points out the very real danger of being eaten. But Patrick is more interested in giving a monster lecture. A real scholar. Corin notices the monsters are flying in organized groups. He realizes this isn't a random attack. They're searching for something. He asks Patrick what he knows about the giant dragon. Patrick explains she's a spire guardian known as the Hero's End, a guardian who protects secrets under the Visage's command. The news makes Corin wonder if this is all connected to Tenjin's disappearance. He wonders if this is all his fault if the monsters are here for Karis. Patrick notices his friend's sudden panic, but Corin is too lost in his guilt to answer. The students are herded into a shelter, though some fear it's just another trap. Inside, the rumbling continues, and the panic only grows worse. Because a basement is always safe from a dragon. Corin scans the crowd, realizing Sarah and his other friends are still missing. Outside, the chaos continues as students scramble for their lives. A cane slams down, demanding silence from the terrified crowd. 3 figures appear, their presence radiating an aura of calm authority. The man in charge snaps his fingers, a silent command for order. He tells the students not to worry, as the monsters are only here for observation. He explains they aren't here to fight, but to find something. And once their search is over, they'll likely just leave. A totally normal field trip. But his speech is cut short by a sudden gust of wind, and a new spectral figure appears in the doorway. The marked student stares, wondering who this could be. The room fills with a heavy pressure as the figure's power radiates outwards. He tries to get a read on the newcomer's aura. Remembering the diviner from the vision, he tries to see their power for himself. And it works, revealing the powerful auras of the 3 mysterious figures. The sensory overload makes his head spin, but the newcomer's aura is a wave of pure malevolence. The sheer power of it makes Corin flinch in pain. The spectral figure descends, addressing the terrified students. A student recognizes him as Chancellor Wallace. He announces the monster attack is over and everyone can return to their dorms. After a brief security sweep, the students are relieved, but the Chancellor's patience is wearing thin. In fact, he's completely done with being patient. Patrick tries to get Corin's attention, but our boy is lost in his work. He finally looks up, acknowledging his friend's presence. He thanks Patrick for the monster lecture, saying it helped him see things more clearly. Patrick is ready to leave, but Corin stays behind to copy some protective runes. Alone, he thinks of Kiris and the dragon, realizing the day's chaos is just the beginning. And if he's going to survive, he has a lot of work to do. The school gives everyone the weekend off after the attack. Patrick checked on Sarah, who was thankfully unharmed in the chaos, but Corin has been keeping his distance, trying to protect her from his problems. Even the usually stoic Jin seems shaken by the recent events. He decides to focus on his enchantments, hoping to add some much-needed offensive power, but he knows testing them is forbidden outside of a designated chamber. For safety reasons. He knows he's in over his head, pushing himself too hard. He worries that even if he gets stronger, it won't be enough to face a demigod or a dragon. But then he remembers the robed figure from the tower. He writes a letter to the voice asking if it's here at the academy. He knows it's a long shot, but it's a lead he has to follow. After a long, fruitless wait, he lets out a frustrated sigh. Because magical pen pals are notoriously slow. But just as he's about to give up, the book begins to write. It starts by correcting his formal tone, preferring its old title. The entity denies any connection to the dragon attack, and tells Corin he has to help fix the mess he started. The book gives him a new mission. Find a way to enter the tower again. Corin clenches his fists, accepting his new impossible task. A week later, classes resume under a heavy, relentless rain. Corin stares out the window, lost in thought as his classmates chatter away. The professor slams her notes down, announcing their break is officially over. She expects them to be recharged, though their studies should never have stopped. Because fun is for the weak. With a bored sigh, she asks, who's ready to do some enchanting? Professor Vellum is about to begin her lesson on runes. When a student asks why their enchanting class involves so much reading on monster hunting, she asks for an explanation, confused by the curriculum. The professor's glare is enough to silence any further questions. Corin already knows the answer, recalling that monsters are the primary source of enchanting materials. She dismisses the interruption and asks the class about the flaws in basic runes. But her question is met with a wall of silence, much to her annoyance. A teacher's favorite sound. Corin finally speaks up, explaining that basic enchantments are only good for a single use. The professor seems impressed, noting this is the first time he's spoken in class. But she quickly warns him never to interrupt her again. With the lesson back on track, Corin eagerly takes notes. Later, the students gather for their dueling class under a heavy, relentless rain. Corin studies on the sidelines, lamenting the high cost of his craft, when a voice calls out his name. Sarah tells Patrick not to bother him, reminding him of Corin's secrecy. A new professor arrives with a large chest, and Corin immediately distrusts his smile. It's filled with dueling canes as the professor begins his lesson on countering spells. He explains a fundamental rule. Like mana deflects, while opposites nullify. The professor looks on as his students stand ready behind him. A demonstration shows how same-type mana deflects an attack, while opposite mana cancels it out. He tells the class to grab a cane for some practical experience. The fun kind of pop quiz. A student with a familiar glowing mark listens intently. He watches as two other students set up tables for the instructors. The professor orders them onto the field, ignoring Roland's complaint about the rain. The students stand in formation on the rain-soaked dueling grounds. One of the girls glances over at the boys, who are clearly miserable. She scoffs and steps forward, ready for the challenge. The professor explains the rules. Fire slow orbs of gray mana, and 3 hits means you're out. Their performance will be judged on hits, deflections, and survival time. They're stuck in their lanes until a neighbor is eliminated. The marked student stands his ground as the rain continues to pour. The professor adds one last rule with a grin. Everyone can fire at once. For maximum chaos. The marked student hopes the others are prepared as the professor signals the start, and the field erupts in a flurry of attacks. The girl from before unleashes the first blast of the match. The marked student stands frozen as his classmates are taken down around him. His eyes widen in confusion. He deflects an incoming blast, noting something is off about these orbs. All around him, the field is a storm of crackling energy. He realizes the attacks are slower than he expected. But they hit with far more power. The professor watches with a smug grin, having armed them with military-grade weapons for a simple drill. For educational purposes. He watches another student get blasted off her feet, before he's struck down himself, crashing to the wet ground. A red-haired student stands over him, his cane still smoking from the shot. Patrick deflects the shot, explaining he's just saving a teammate. Sarah tells him she'd rather he didn't. But her protest is cut short as 2 more students are eliminated behind her. Roland calmly calls out the eliminations, warning Sarah not to get distracted. Patrick tells Corin to focus, saying he can thank him later. Corin is surprised by his friend's sudden seriousness, but knows he's right. He takes a breath and focuses, his eyes glowing with renewed determination. He activates his attunement, feeling the energy spheres all around him, and deflects an incoming attack with perfect timing. But his deflection accidentally takes out another student. You know, friendly fire isn't friendly. He sheepishly apologizes to the fallen student before resolving to get serious. With his attunement active, he scans the chaotic battlefield. The field is starting to clear as nearly half the students have been eliminated. He realizes his side is losing and badly. To make matters worse, Marissa is on the other team, deflecting shots without even using her cane. She raises a hand ready to meet another blast, and redirects it with a powerful open-palmed strike. The attack slams into the ground, a testament to the field's durability. Another student on his side is taken out by a swift kick. Corin hesitates to use his mana, remembering the warning about permanent scarring, but he decides it's time to test a new hypothesis. He fires a single shot, taking out an opponent with perfect aim. Corin just smirks, a new plan already in motion. He begins firing wildly, his shots missing their marks. The other students mock his terrible aim, completely unaware of his true strategy, until one of his missed shots ricochets, taking out another opponent. You know, a totally calculated bank shot. Patrick follows his lead, eliminating another student from the field. The two of them share a look of perfect teamwork, but his celebration is cut short as Marissa lands a direct hit. The pain from his attunement flares and the professor warns him to be careful. Patrick reminds him he's one hit away from elimination. He admits he's in the same boat, but at least they have two more allies, just as two more of their teammates are instantly eliminated, leaving only Sarah and Roland as their remaining opponents. The field has cleared, leaving a 2-on-3 showdown. Patrick compliments his ricochet shot, and Corin explains his new plan. But Marissa is a close combat specialist, and a direct assault would be suicide. Attacking Sarah and Roland would leave them open to her from behind. So he gives Patrick a new command. Fire on his signal. You know, a totally foolproof plan. He knows it's a risky move, but it's their only chance as he begins the countdown. Corin holds his cane steady, his attunement mark glowing. Sarah channels her own power into her weapon. Patrick yells for Corin to attack while Marissa is distracted. The other students can only watch in disbelief. Corin looks back, realizing the plan is in motion. Sarah unleashes a massive blast, hoping it's not too much. You know, a slight overreaction for a school drill. Patrick immediately panics, worried they've gone too far. But the professor seems to be enjoying the show. Marissa raises her cane, preparing to deflect the massive attack. Corin and Patrick are stunned. She's even attempting to block it. Corin grits his teeth, realizing his plan has gone sideways. But Marissa meets the blast with a single punch, shattering it. The shockwave sends everyone stumbling back. The professor watches from the sidelines, thoroughly entertained. You know, just another day in the office. Marissa stands amidst the steam, completely unfazed. She stomps over to Corin, furious at his reckless move. Corin tries to explain he was just trying to create an opening. But he quickly realizes he's in a lot of trouble. She points her cane, taking out both him and Patrick. And with that, the match is officially over. The professor applauds from the sidelines. He calls it an excellent show and announces it's time to award points. Sarah and Roland are praised for their endurance, with Roland earning extra for his foresight. Marissa is also awarded points for her powerful performance, but she's stunned when Corin is rewarded for his reckless strategy. The professor explains that while overcharging a cane is usually illegal, he never made it a rule, so he's rewarding Corin for getting away with it. You know, a great lesson in sportsmanship. As class is dismissed, Marissa stomps off, convinced he only got points because he's a noble. Other students grumble about the same people always getting recognized. But Patrick praises Corin's quick thinking, saying his strategies are a real asset. Patrick tries to be optimistic, but Corin knows they were no match for Marissa. He agrees she's strong, but his mind flashes back to the true monsters he's faced. He realizes his raw power and tactics alone won't be enough to survive. So he decides it's time to pick up some enchanting supplies. He heads to a local shop, a long list of materials in hand, and is immediately hit with the sticker shock of high-level gear. You know, because power is never cheap. He knows gems are out of his price range and rings won't hold enough mana. He needs something he can hold, debating between a cane and a gauntlet. A shopkeeper offers him a simple demi-gauntlet, the only thing he can afford. But the man smirks, saying he might have just the thing for a boy seeking power. The shopkeeper offers a legendary axe, but Corin knows he can't afford it. He explains he already has a magic weapon, and the man asks to see it. The man's eyes widen in shock as he recognizes the blade. He calls it Celis Lian, the goddess's tears, and reveals it's cursed. He tells the story of a warrior who loved the goddess from afar. She reached the top only to face the great dragon Mizuchi. The goddess wept for her fallen champion, her tears reforging the blade. The shopkeeper is moved to tears, but Korin is skeptical of the tale. A bit of a plot hole. He explains the blade is traitorous, always failing its wielder at the end. He says they are often betrayed by a trusted companion, but is cut off by the door. A new customer arrives, greeted warmly by the shopkeeper. The man introduces himself as Derek, and Korin does the same. Derek reveals he was a schoolmate of Korin's brother, Tristan. He apologizes for bringing up the painful memory, but Korin accepts it. The shopkeeper gives him a free anti-curse trinket as he leaves. Derek questions if curses are real, but the shopkeeper says it's better to be safe. Just in case. Back in his room, Korin wonders if the story is assigned to work alone. He's been so focused on survival that he's forgotten his true purpose. He remembers Tristan, his resolve hardening once more. But his thoughts are cut short by a knock from Sarah at his door. She tells him she was hoping they could talk. Her voice echoes from the other side of the door. But he wonders if this is another test from the professor. So he asks a security question only the real Sarah would know. She reluctantly answers, complaining about his strategy, and her need to mention the final score confirms it's her. Because some things never change. Her patience, however, is clearly wearing thin. He finally opens the door, reminding her of the assassin. She points out he never actually explained that whole situation. The two of them stand in a tense, expectant silence. Sarah cuts him off, saying she's not here for his excuses. She asks him a simple, painful question. Does he not trust her? She reminds him of his wild claim about assassins, and that it's not exactly a normal part of the student experience. In case he forgot. She admits it's not about her safety. She's worried about him. Korin can only look away, the weight of his secrets holding him down. She knows if he's not talking to her, he's not talking to anyone. He tries to reassure her, saying a professor is helping him. But she brings up a new problem, the midterm tower test. A test he had no idea was coming, proving her point perfectly. She explains the final exam is at the Serpent Spire, but the midterm is in a mock tower. And just like the final, the practicals will require a team of 5. She points out that Korin probably doesn't have 4 friends lined up for a team. He realizes this was all a recruitment pitch and agrees, but she playfully rejects his offer. He tries to call her bluff, saying he'll ask Patrick and Roland, but she says Roland is busy. Korin realizes she's just scouting for her own team, not trying to join his. He finally gives in, agreeing to join her on 2 conditions. Her first condition, he has to find the other 2 members, and she suggests Jin. She teases him until he reluctantly agrees to recruit Jin and find one more person. He nervously asks for her second condition. Her second condition is simple. She wants to know what he's been working on. Korin lets out a sigh of relief, happy to finally share his work. He decides it's better to show her than to just explain. So he leads her to a secure facility known as the Grey Chambers. Inside, Korin asks about the purpose of the strange building. He explains it's a reinforced area, designed specifically for enchanting. A place built to withstand the kind of mistakes that could level a building. He boasts that a big enough failure could wipe out a town, but Sarah doubts he has the mana for that. A fair point. He asks for his new creation, which he's dubbed the Power Glove, much to her disgust. He slips on the gauntlet, telling her to examine the runes he's designed. He proudly explains the capacity runes on his gauntlet. It can hold 10 times his mana before it explodes. Sarah points out his mana couldn't level a town, but he explains how a simple miscalculation could, basic enchanting math. Sarah decides she'll be waiting safely outside for this part. She questions if this is too dangerous for a first attempt. Alone, he steels his resolve knowing he's out of options. He begins to channel his power into the gauntlet. A massive explosion rocks the chamber, and Sarah cries out his name. The blast sends him into a memory of another painful failure. A memory of Tristan's hand reaching out to him. He's shaken back to consciousness by Sarah's frantic voice. He wakes up on the floor as another student heals him. Professor Vellum holds the smoking gauntlet, scolding his recklessness. Korin insists he followed all the rules from his textbook. But the professor points out he was using a first-year guide, a guide that doesn't cover the advanced magic he was attempting. Because reading ahead is dangerous. She tosses the gauntlet back, asking what drove him to create it. But she's impressed by his ambition, telling him to find her when he's healed, because she's going to teach him some real enchanting. Korin tries to spin his explosive failure into a win, but Sarah reminds him that getting hurt is never a success. She complains about having to carry his smoking invention. He teases her, and she sighs at his unwavering arrogance. You know, a near-death experience builds character. She tells him not to expect her help next time. But Corin just offers a simple, heartfelt thank you. A quiet moment passes between the two of them. She tells him to use his recovery time to find their teammates. And with a final warning, she runs off into the night. Corin sighs, dreading the social interaction that lies ahead. Corin goes to find his first potential teammate. He knocks on Jin's door but gets no immediate answer. But Jin appears behind him, surprised by the role reversal. He immediately asks if this is another assassination attempt, but Corin nervously denies it. He asks to come inside, but Jin prefers they talk outside. So they stand on the balcony, enjoying the view. You know, a totally normal place for a serious conversation. Jin asks about his enchanting, and Corin admits his failure is the reason he's injured. But then a sudden realization dawns on him. He accuses Jin of spying, since he never mentioned his enchanting. But Jin just blames the dorm's thin walls. And Corin's habit of thinking out loud. You know, a classic main character trope. Jin reveals the real reason for his visit. He has a shopping list for Corin. The requests are for stealth items, and Corin realizes Jin is trying to fake other attunements. Jin admits he's taking 3 different classes to keep his true abilities a secret. Corin finds his new friend's honesty refreshing, but still can't get a read on him. He wonders if Jin is the spy from the Spider Division, since he has no readable aura. Corin admits that while he appreciates the trust, the request might be a little difficult. He's too embarrassed to admit he's never finished an enchantment without it blowing up. You know, a minor detail. So he blames his lack of funds, but Jin offers to pay for everything. Corin is immediately suspicious, but Jin explains his family is from House Dalen, a name that carries more than enough weight to fund this little side project. Corin's mind reels, realizing he's talking to royalty. You know, just a casual chat with a prince. But he quickly changes the subject, asking if he can go first. He awkwardly explains the team practicals are coming up, and asks Jin to join, who agrees but with a strange condition. He'll join if Corin makes the items, sealing the deal with a handshake. Corin agrees, but politely declines the handshake. You know, personal space is important. He lets out a sigh of relief, having secured his first recruit, but he knows the next one will be a much tougher sell. Later, he finds himself knocking on a door in the female dorms. A blonde girl opens it, surprised to see him standing there. He awkwardly tries to ask her something, but she's more focused on his bandaged hand. He admits it was an enchanting accident, and she agrees he deserved it. You know, a totally sympathetic response. With a heavy sigh, she invites him inside to talk. She makes it clear this is strictly business before telling him to get on with it. Corin realizes he's still on her bad side, and her unimpressed stare confirms his suspicion. He tries to apologize for his reckless strategy in the dueling class, but she cuts him off. She's stunned, explaining that nobles don't usually apologize for anything. She reveals she's not from a noble family, but a simple farm girl. Corin connects her hometown to another student, Rupert Kent. She explains Rupert and his father have been trying to recruit her for years, and their persistence has made her distrustful of all nobles. Her words resonate with Corin, who knows all about that kind of pressure. You know, from personal experience. He tells her he understands completely. He explains his own attunement is considered worthless for combat, and that he only targeted her because he knew she could handle it. He then asks her to join his team for the practicals. She immediately accuses him of trying to buy her loyalty. He quickly denies it, saying it's about mutual support, and that he's just trying to learn how to be a better friend. Corin decides to head to Sarah's room with the good news, but he's stopped by a strange sight in the hallway. It's Patrick, looking incredibly nervous with a bouquet of roses. Corin startles his friend, asking what he's doing here. Patrick awkwardly claims he's just visiting, like Corin. Corin gives him a long, suspicious stare, and pats him on the head, trying to snap him out of it. He suggests they knock, but Patrick panics, saying he's not ready. Corin lets his friend take the lead, wondering what's gotten into him. Patrick takes a deep breath and finally knocks on the door. Patrick suggests she's not home and they should try the library. He then eagerly asks to join Corin on his search. As they walk, Patrick nervously asks if Corin is dating Sarah. Corin quickly shuts that down, reminding him she's now family. Patrick is relieved, admitting he was worried about competing with him. He reveals his plan to ask Sarah to the winter ball. You know, a totally smooth operator. Corin, however, has never even heard of the event. The realization finally dawns, and he struggles to hold back a laugh. Patrick's confidence shatters, thinking Corin is mocking him. But Corin explains he's just laughing at his own obliviousness. Corin tries to reassure his friend, but Patrick is convinced he's not good enough for Sarah. He explains the class divide, seeing himself as a nobody compared to them. Corin questions if nobility still matters, a thought that feels strangely familiar. Patrick then brings up the biggest obstacle, Corin's notoriously disapproving father. You know, the man of the year. He imagines Sarah at the grand citywide ball, surrounded by other, more suitable partners. The thought gives Corin pause, wondering if her new status has changed her. He considers if she'd prefer a worthy suitor over just a friend. He snaps out of it, apologizing for getting lost in his own head. Corin admits he doesn't really know what Sarah would want anymore. He offers to play matchmaker, but Patrick quickly changes the subject to another favor. Corin misreads the situation entirely, asking if Patrick wants to go to the ball with him. But Patrick's request is far more serious. He wants to become Corin's retainer. He explains that by serving Corin, he might finally be seen as worthy of Sarah. He even pulls out a copy of the oath. You know, just something he carries around for emergencies. He makes it clear that the choice is entirely up to Corin. Corin can only look on, touched by his friend's sincerity. He'd always wanted a retainer, someone to watch his back, and realizes Patrick has always been that person. He admits to himself this is far better than his old fantasy of Sarah kneeling before him, and even if his friend's motives are mixed, he knows Patrick is someone he can trust. So Corin accepts, honored to have his friend by his side. With an audience of their classmates watching, Corin formally accepts Patrick into his service. Patrick recites the oath, pledging his loyalty and strength, and with that, he officially becomes a retainer of House Cadence. Corin notes this is another handshake he's been forced into, but for this, he's more than willing to make an exception. As they walk away, Patrick can barely contain his excitement. You know, a totally professional and stoic retainer. He then asks Corin if he has a date for the winter ball, a question Corin admits he's never even considered. He then remembers to tell Sarah their team is finally set, much to Patrick's surprise. Corin reveals his plan to build enchanted items for everyone. Patrick is thrilled by the idea of custom gear, but he questions how Corin will afford it, and Corin says he knows a guy. That guy, however, immediately shuts him down. Jin clarifies their deal was only for the two of them, not the whole team. Corin is confused, explaining the materials come from monster cores. Jin explains that in his culture, selling the spoils of battle is a grave insult. You know, a matter of principle. He agrees to help Corin and himself, but no one else, leaving Corin to sigh, his grand plan hitting a major financial roadblock. He realizes he's going to need to find some money, and fast. Corin looks forward to his first private lesson with Professor Vellum. He hopes she can help him find the materials he so desperately needs. But after 30 minutes of waiting, his excitement turns to frustration. Just then, the professor finally appears down the hall. He greets her, but she walks right past him without a word, and slams her office door shut, leaving him completely stunned. He worries she might have forgotten about their lesson entirely. He tries to convince himself that can't possibly be the case. He sighs, realizing none of the professors here make things easy. You know, a great student experience. He knocks on the door and is finally told to enter. He peeks into the professor's office, a chaotic den of books and cats. She greets him as a prodigy, and for a moment he's flattered, only for her to finish her sentence, of idiots. You know, a great start to their private tutoring. He steps inside, holding his smoking gauntlet, and offers a polite greeting. An awkward silence falls between them, broken only by a cat's meow. She asks why he's here, and he reminds her of their scheduled lesson. She then asks what he wants to study, and Corin realizes he's on his own. He decides to start with his failed gauntlet, hoping to fix it for the practicals. The professor says the problem is obvious, a lesson he should have learned in dueling class. She explains that mixing the wrong mana types causes explosions, a detail his other professor conveniently forgot to mention. She laments that most of the staff are just as neglectful. You know, a real top-tier institution. Corin still doesn't understand how the mana mixed with two separate runes. So she gives him a new pop quiz, asking him to examine a dueling cane. He studies the weapon, searching for the key difference. The professor points out the circles, which act as boundaries for the runes. Corin admits he thought they were just for decoration, much to her despair. She then asks why he's pushing himself so hard, and he explains his deadline. She reveals his failed gauntlet is already at the carnelian level, stunning him, but she clarifies it's at the very bottom of that rank, and he has a long way to go. She then points out his mental mana is terrible, questioning if he's even been trying. He admits he's afraid of using his mental mana, fearing he'll lose his mind. The professor points out he almost did that anyway with his little gauntlet experiment. She reminds him that enchanters rely on mental mana, and he can't just avoid it. She explains he'd get headaches long before any real damage, but he's still hesitant. So she gives him his first assignment. train his mental mana every single day. And with that, she kicks him out of her office. A very nurturing teaching style. Corin is left alone in the hall, his frustration growing. He realizes he never even got to ask about gathering materials. Later, Sarah questions why he's brought her to a local shop. He explains he promised to make gear for the team, but she reminds him that was his deal, not hers. He teases her, saying she's finally catching on. But their bickering is cut short by a sudden bell. Sarah reminds him she's just as broke as he is, but Corin thought their father might have been more generous with her. Just then, a new voice cuts in, and they turn to see a familiar face. It's Derek, who immediately mistakes Sarah for Corin's girlfriend. A totally normal family dynamic. Derek introduces himself properly, and Sarah does the same. She's immediately charmed, much to Corin's silent disgust. Derek then turns to Corin, revealing this meeting wasn't a coincidence. He offers Corin a spot in a survival match, a high-stakes monster fight. Corin recalls his father's disdain for such events, seeing them as beneath a true duelist. Derek reveals Corin's mother was an expert fighter, a fact even Sarah knew. He explains the rules of the match, a brutal endurance test against waves of monsters. He offers Corin a cut of the prize money, but our boy is hesitant to join a direct fight. Corin weighs the risk against his desperate need for enchanting materials. To Sarah's complete shock, he agrees to do it. She questions his sudden resolve, but reminds him this could solve his money problems. He worries about the danger, but she assures him she'll be fine. She proudly declares that as a cadence, fighting is in her blood. A real family tradition. She accepts the offer for both of them, and Derek asks about her attunement. Sarah proudly reveals she's a summoner, ready for the challenge ahead. Derek is impressed by her attunement, but Corin is less than thrilled by this whole arrangement. Patrick is excited to be in the VIP box, but Corin feels completely out of place among the wealthy spectators. He wonders why his entire team had to come watch, as the scene flashes back a few hours. Sarah was getting ready for the match, and Corin questioned her choice of outfit for a monster fight. She explained her simple philosophy. If you look good, you feel good, and that leads to a better performance. Corin sarcastically agrees with her flawless logic, but she tells him he'll just be watching from a box seat. She then reveals he's going to invite Patrick, Jin, and Marissa to watch with him. She calls it a team bonding exercise, a chance to get to know each other before the practicals, which brings him back to the present, crammed uncomfortably close to his new teammates. A great bonding experience. He's just relieved that Jin decided not to come, sparing him from even more social agony. Corin tries to make sense of Sarah's team bonding idea. Marissa complains they look out of place in their school uniforms. But Corin points out other students before spotting Sarah in the arena below. An announcer's voice booms, welcoming the crowd to the survival matches. Derek and Sarah stand together, ready to make their entrance. Patrick is stunned, asking why Sarah has a partner he didn't know about. The announcer introduces the duo, Derek Hardigan and Sarah of House Cadence. Sarah asks how long the matches last, and Derek explains most teams don't make it past the first round. He tells her to follow his lead and she'll be fine. A totally reassuring pep talk. The bell rings and Derek signals for the arena walls to rise. Derek tells Sarah to hang back and provide support. She immediately summons a set of floating ice crystals. As the match begins, a wave of slime swarms the arena. The two of them stand their ground, ready for the first wave. Derek moves with incredible speed, cutting down the monsters with ease. He even takes a moment to play to the adoring crowd. A real showman. But a slime tries to get the drop on him, only to be frozen by Sarah. He gives her a grateful thumbs up for the save. With the easy part over, Derek soaks in the applause. But the next wave is far more intimidating, a beast Corin recognizes from the tower. Derek ignites his blade, determined not to be outshined. Sarah raises a massive wall of ice to hold the beast back, and Derek leaps over it, cutting the monster down with a fiery slash. Corin can only watch in shock, remembering his own struggle against that same creature. But their victory is short-lived as a massive ogre smashes through the ice. The announcer declares a surprise, saying the match is being sped up. A winged beast descends, a monster usually saved for the final round. Patrick recognizes it from the school invasion, and Corin knows they're in trouble. The creature taunts them, crackling with lightning, much to the crowd's horror. Because talking monsters are never a good sign. Derek tells Sarah to handle the ogre while he takes on the new threat. Sarah utters a single word, encasing the ogre's legs in ice. Derek points out her spell is far too slow to stop the beast. But her real plan was much, much simpler. The massive ogre slips on the ice, crashing to the ground. A classic cartoon takedown. Meanwhile, Derek lands a critical strike on the winged monster. He He warns Sarah not to get distracted as the ogre is taken care of. From the stands, Corin and his friends can only watch in shock, but the winged beast just laughs, completely unfazed by the attack. It unleashes a massive wave of crackling energy, but Sarah is ready, shielding them both in a barrier of solid ice. The monster is stunned, unable to believe what's happening. Just as a fiery figure slams into the ground beside Sarah, Derek thanks his summon for the assist, taunting his fallen opponent. He compliments Sarah's strategy as they stand over the defeated beast, and with a single word, she binds the monster, ending the fight. From the stands, her friends can only watch in stunned admiration. The crowd erupts in a thunderous applause for their victory. Patrick and Marissa cheer her on from their box seats. You know, a real supportive friend group, but Corin is lost in thought, comparing her bravery to his own hesitation in the tower. Patrick snaps him out of it, and Corin plays it off as simple relief. But from the stands, Corin notices something is off. Down in the arena, Sarah is clearly exhausted, the last spell having drained her mana. Derek offers to help, his confidence unwavering. He orders his fiery summon to transfer its own mana directly to her. Corin and Marissa are stunned by the dangerous move, and by the fact that Derek's sword is apparently sentient. You know, as if the day wasn't weird enough. Just then, the announcer introduces a special guest for the final round. A new woman appears, and Corin recognizes her instantly from the memory crystal. It's Elora Theus, the sorceress who fought alongside his mother against Karas. She walks down from the stands, teasing Derek about his new younger partner. Derek plays along, dramatically inviting his old flame to join them in the arena. Derek smirks, offering to give Elora a proper greeting. She calmly promises to console him after his defeat, before announcing her final opponent. Elora begins a powerful chant, and Derek warns Sarah to get out of the ring. She summons a massive golden wyvern, stunning both Derek and Sarah. From the stands, Corin's friends can only watch in horror. Elora wishes Derek luck as he leaps forward to meet the challenge. You know, a totally fair final round. But his flaming sword can't even scratch the beast's tough scales. The wyvern whips its massive tail, sending him flying. He's thrown helplessly through the air, and lands hard on the ground, completely disarmed. But Sarah is there in an instant, trapping the beast's feet in ice. From the stands, Corin can only scream for her to run. She encases herself in a desperate last-ditch ice shell, but the wyvern shatters her defense with a single contemptuous swipe. She's thrown back, injured and bleeding from the impact. In the stands, Patrick tries to leap into the fray, but his friends hold him back. He begs Corin to do something, but our boy knows they'd just be more targets. Down below, Sarah is on her knees, completely spent as the monster closes in. But even at her limit, a fire still burns in her eyes. She unleashes one final desperate barrage of ice shards. Derek seizes the opening, plunging his sword into the beast's jaw. Her desperate move was all he needed to bring the wyvern down. Derek celebrates their victory a little too early. You know, classic rookie mistake. But the wyvern's tail whips around with a final desperate strike, and sends Derek flying out of the ring, eliminating him from the match. Her friends can only scream for her to run, but Corin knows better, because a cadence never backs down from a fight. She begins a new summoning, ready to continue the battle alone. With her last bit of strength, she summons the ogre from the previous round, and Corin realizes her binding spells weren't just for defense. Corin explains her strategy to his stunned friends. He knows the mana cost is dangerous, but Sarah has calculated the risks. He smiles, realizing they're more alike than he ever thought. Down below, Sarah reaches for Derek's fallen sword, needing one last summon, and calls forth a new powerful ally, the demon Carvenzi. The demon seems less than thrilled to be called so soon. You know, a real attitude problem. She orders him to aim for the wyvern's weak point, and he agrees with a smirk. Carvenzi gets the beast's attention with a firm grip, and asks the wyvern how it feels about fire. He watches the beast take flight, trying to remember how Derek used this sword. He hurls the blade like a spear, piercing the wyvern's neck. Carvenzi wonders where the sword's spirit is, but Sarah just tells him to end it. He tells the crowd to enjoy the show as the sky darkens. A massive spell circle ignites with crackling lightning, unleashing a storm of power upon the beast below. But even at her limit, Sarah tries to bind the wyvern to her will. You know, because one can never have too many giant monsters. With the beast finally down, she collapses the new champion. She lies on the ground, a single tear of relief on her face. From the stands, her friends cheer wildly for her victory, their voices echoing through the now silent arena. Medics rush Sarah away on a stretcher as Corin warns them about the wyvern's poison. They try to send her friends away, but Patrick refuses to leave her side. Just then, Derek arrives, calling the whole thing an incredible show. He lounges in the recovery room, completely unbothered by Patrick's fury. A real class act. A medic clenches his fist, warning them to stop fighting or get out. Corin accuses Derek of treating it all like a game, but he claims he was just as surprised. He asks if Derek's summon can help, but the man admits he's completely drained. Corin's patience finally snaps, telling Derek to get up and do something useful. He accuses Derek of being careless, but Derek says Sarah chose to stay in the fight. He then reminds Corin that he was the one invited, and this is all his fault. The words hit Corin and he finally snaps, but Derek takes the blow, admitting he deserves it. He promises to use his winnings to buy her recovery potions. A small price to pay for almost getting her killed. But as he turns to leave, Corin stops him. Derek reminds him that he has people waiting for him too. The excuse only infuriates Corin's friends even more. But Corin tells them to go home, trusting the medics. He formally orders Patrick to leave, as his new retainer. As his friends depart, Corin is left alone with Sarah. A medic finally delivers some good news about her condition. The medic asks about her family, and Corin finally calls her his sister. His mind drifts back to a time when she tried to pull him out of his shell, a memory of his friends always waiting with a friendly wave. But back then, he could only call out for his brother in fear, remembering Tristan's calm voice, always there to reassure him. He's shaken from his thoughts by Sarah, who's finally awake. She's already eating, eager to leave, much to Corin's relief. A true sign of recovery. He asks about her mana usage, worried about the damage she's done. She admits she drew from every source she had, a truly reckless move. He scolds her for the risk, but she insists she knew her own limits. But Sarah argues that when you're pushed to the brink, you do what you have to do to win. Corin's mind, however, is already racing with a new idea. She then tosses him a heavy bag of coins. He's stunned by the amount, but she says it's for his enchanting materials. She reminds him he has 3 weeks to make good on his promise to the team. He compliments her amazing performance and she smugly agrees. Because humility is for losers, but her bravado quickly fades as she wobbles, the toll of the fight finally hitting her. He calls her his sister, and she teases him for the rare moment of sincerity. Later, in Professor Vellum's office, she questions his strange new project. He explains his idea for a device that can track his mana levels in real time. Professor Vellum dismisses his idea, saying experts learn by feel. But Corin argues that's a flawed approach that can lead to disaster. She dismisses the idea, telling him to focus on strengthening his attunement. The thing he's been actively avoiding. He smugly asks if she can't tell he's gotten stronger. She bluntly informs him his mental mana is too weak to even measure any progress. She realizes he hasn't used it at all since their last meeting. He stammers, blaming his lack of a mana reader for the lack of proof. With a sigh, she tells him to use mana crystals and kicks him out. Corin, however, decides she's his favorite mentor so far. A real glowing review. 12 days before the practicals, Jin arrives with the promised materials. Jin asks for another favor, but Corin is hesitant to take on more work. Jin notes that his enchanting seems to be going well, with multiple high-level items in progress, but Corin admits he's worried they won't work, taking extra precautions after his last failure. Jin points to the gauntlet, and Corin warns him it could still explode. A totally safe work environment. He tries to explain his fix, but is cut off by a sudden blast of energy from the gauntlet. Jin scolds him for the reckless test, but Corin insists it was a success. Jin offers a hand, telling Corin he should have more faith in his own abilities. But Corin is tired of things blowing up in his face, worried about putting others at risk. He tries to get back to work, but Jin stops him, revealing the real reason for his visit. He brings up the winter ball, and Corin offers to play matchmaker for him. But Jin clarifies he wants Corin to come as his date. A totally normal end to a business meeting. The request sends Corin into a full-blown panic. He stammers, trying to explain his aversion to touching, but Jin is surprisingly understanding. He tells Corin to take his time, giving him a chance to think it over. Corin tries to process the situation, deciding he can at least handle a conversation. With his mind made up, he finally agrees to the date. Later, Corin is hard at work, meticulously checking his new enchantments. He's finished the gear for his team, but worries if it will be good enough. The process has drained his mental mana, pushing him to his limits. But his new mana watch confirms his training is working, even if he still has a long way to go. He knows he's made progress, but his attunement is still far from where it needs to be. He recalls Jin's cryptic advice, but has no idea what strengths he's supposed to trust. He can only wonder what someone like Jin sees in him. And soon enough, the day of the practical exam arrives. Patrick is already panicking about being late, but Marissa tells him to relax. He frets about the risk of expulsion, and Marissa tells him to just breathe. A solid game plan. Sarah finally arrives, brushing off any concern for her previous injuries. Just as Jin appears out of nowhere asking where Corin is, the others are surprised, assuming the two would have arrived together. Marissa decides they should check in, but a voice suddenly calls for them to wait. Corin finally arrives, explaining he was triple-checking their new gear. He tosses the first item to Marissa, telling her to see for herself. He's made custom items for everyone. Bracelets for Marissa, a ring for Patrick, and a monocle for Jin. Patrick is completely baffled by the monocle, wondering what it could possibly do. Corin explains it helps Jin see through illusions, a small sign of growing trust. After Jin's approval, Corin turns to Sarah with one last gift. She reminds him she never asked for anything, but he couldn't leave out his sister. He offers her a bracer, a proper welcome to the family. She teases him about not getting a power glove, but he explains its function. It stores a full mana reserve, a gift inspired by her fight in the arena. Sarah thanks him with a sudden hug, much to Corin's touch-averse horror. He plays it cool, saying he had a lot of guidance that mostly involved being yelled at by Professor Vellum. The nurturing kind. As the team admires their new gear, Corin watches from a distance, and together they head towards the mock tower for their exam. But a familiar face is already there to greet them. Professor Orden. She says she's here to watch the show and check on his progress. Sarah asks about their first trial, but the professor has a surprise. They'll be split into pairs, with a bell to swap out teammates. Sarah immediately takes charge, pairing Marissa with Patrick and herself with Corin. Sarah asks for a heads up, but the professor isn't giving any hints. Jin volunteers to go first, explaining his monocle is their best bet against illusions. They pepper the professor with questions about the rules, but she remains cryptic about the scoring. Their endless questions clearly annoy her, and she wonders if overthinking is a family trait. A totally fair assessment. With time up, she finally sends them off to begin the exam. The professor gives the signal, and the practical officially begins. The team leader tries to stay confident in their plan, but they're immediately plunged into total darkness with Patrick unable to see a thing. Jin's monocle reveals 6 torches lining the walls, and he asks Patrick for a light. Patrick chants a spell, and a single torch bursts into flame. Jin finds a hint on a stone tablet, while a spirit claims the exit is in the fountain. They find a cryptic poem on the wall, a warning about being devoured in the dark. Just then, the torches extinguish one by one, and Patrick is immediately caught in the jaws of a massive beast. Because the poem was being literal. Meanwhile, in another chamber, Sarah and Corin navigate an icy room, as do Marissa and her partner Mara, who suggests checking for traps. But Mara quickly realizes they're not alone. A massive serpent-like monster emerges from the ice. Marissa prepares to fight, ready to use the water to her advantage. But Mara leaps forward, striking the beast with a powerful punch. Professor Orden questions his strategy of staying on the sidelines. She offers some cryptic advice about becoming the main player in his own life. Corin is confused, but she tells him he has to test his limits to improve. Just then, Patrick is ejected from the trial, and the professor smugly notes their first loss. He collapses to the floor, and she assures Corin it's just a simulated knockout. For educational purposes. She asks what he'll do now that he's been forced into the game. Corin steals his resolve, determined to finish this test. The professor just smiles, eager to see what he's capable of. He steps into the dark chamber, wondering where Jin has gone. He sees 2 torches are lit, but 4 more remain untouched. He rereads the cryptic passage on the wall, a riddle about 6 visages. Suddenly, a shadowy beast lunges from the darkness, tackling him to the ground. Corin grits his teeth, shaken by the sudden ambush. Jin explains the creature can phase through walls, a shadow beast of some kind. He confirms he's all right, having narrowly avoided the attack. Jin gets a little too close for comfort, suggesting they strategize quickly. Personal space is optional during an exam. After a moment of awkward silence, Jin finally backs away. He explains the torch puzzle. They must be lit in matching elemental pairs. But Patrick was taken out before they could solve the rest of the sequence. Corin looks around the dark chamber, asking how Jin has survived this long. Corin is just glad to see his invisibility detecting monocle is working. They try to figure out what kind of mana will light the other torches. Corin rereads the poem, guessing the pairs are physical, mental, and light. He decides to try transference mana, and the torch lights up instantly. But a massive beast appears, and Jin tells Corin to go while he creates a distraction. The creature smashes Jin against the wall with a powerful blow. A totally effective distraction. Corin calls out in horror as his own gauntlet begins to glow. Jin fires his pistol from the ground, trying to hold the monster back. but the beast seems to absorb the energy, and Jin yells for him to light the final torch. The monster suddenly shifts into a ghostly cat, and Korin realizes he can't see through its illusion. He knows Jin's attacks did nothing, and doubts his gauntlet will be any better. He grips his cane, wondering if he has any other options. The beast lunges forward, pinning him to the ground. It opens its jaws, preparing to unleash a blast of fire. But its attack is met by another, as a new monster calls out Korin's name. Meanwhile, Marissa and Mara face their own dragon in a treasure-filled room. You know, a totally fair exam. Mara finds a key, and Marissa tells her to just punch her way out. So Mara winds up and delivers a powerful blow to the beast's head. Marissa can only stare, stunned by her partner's raw power. But the dragon just glares back, completely unfazed by the attack. Mara tosses the key to Marissa, telling her to make a run for it. But the key doesn't work, and the dragon unleashes a wave of fire. Marissa realizes they're out of time and options. So she plunges her sword into the beast's head. Back in the dark chamber, Korin lands a critical blow on his own monster. The beast collapses, and Korin tells Jin to finish it. Jin calmly draws his pistol, ready to comply. As Korin nurses his injuries, Jin makes absolutely sure the monster is dead. You know, just to be thorough. He confirms the kill, his pistol still smoking. He then offers Korin a potion, saying he's useless to him like this. Jin scolds him for the reckless move, but admits it gave him an idea. He asks Korin to light the final torch with his gauntlet, and with a flash of blue energy, the last torch is lit. The fountain in the center of the room begins to glow, revealing the exit. The two of them share a laugh, relieved to have survived the trial. They now face two doors, debating which path to take next. Just as an explosion rocks the chamber next to them, Mara shatters a wall of ice, much to Marissa's surprise. You know, a totally subtle entrance. The two groups find themselves staring at each other through the new opening. Korin panics, asking Sarah why she's breaking the walls, but she just says no one told her not to. Sarah suggests they team up, but Korin worries about breaking the rules. Just then, Professor Orden appears, looking less than thrilled. She announces their test has been terminated, much to their confusion. Her explanation is short and absolutely terrifying. The city is under attack by monsters from the Serpent Spire, and this time it's a full-blown assault, not just a search party. You know, a slight escalation. They're sent back to the briefing room where a relieved Patrick greets them. The professor cuts their reunion short, but Patrick points out the very loud explosions. Just as she's about to respond, another professor makes a dramatic entrance. It's Lord Teft, and Professor Orden is clearly not amused by his arrival. Lord Teft reports that a commander is waiting, but he has more urgent news. He stammers, a sight that clearly surprises Professor Orden. The students listen in shock as he reveals the attack is led by a man named Katashi. Professor Orden's expression shifts as a new plan begins to form. She declares she'll send Korin out to negotiate, much to Teft's horror. You know, a totally safe field trip. She calls Korin forward, saying it's time to deal with his past mistakes. His friends look to him for answers, but our boy can only stammer in response. So the professor decides to tell them everything herself. She theorizes Katashi is either looking for the prisoners Korin freed, or for Korin himself, and that sending him out might be their only way to stop the attack. Lord Teft protests, but the professor dismisses his concerns. Sarah immediately steps in, refusing to let Korin be used as a sacrifice. The professor insists it's just a negotiation, but Sarah declares she's going with him. Patrick and Marissa quickly join in, refusing to be left behind. You know, because peer pressure is a powerful motivator. But Jin politely declines, wanting no part in a conflict with a visage. Lord Teft sighs, accepting their decision and telling them to prepare. Sarah reaches for Korin's hand, ready to teleport them all to the gate. But Korin turns away, his arms crossed in defiance. He declares he'll go alone with Lord Teft, pushing his friends away. Sarah pleads with him, but his answer remains a firm, unyielding no. The professor tells them to make a choice, but Korin's mind is already made up. His friends protest, telling him this is no time to play the hero. But he gently pushes Sarah away, his decision firm. He explains his logic, hoping he's a low enough priority to survive. You know, a totally sound theory. He asks the professor to teleport his friends to safety once he's gone. With the plan set, the two professors begin the teleportation spell. Korin is pulled away as Sarah cries out his name. He knows this is a burden he must carry alone, a responsibility he can't escape. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the man in charge is already losing his patience. Katashi declares he has no time to waste on mortals. Lord Teft tells Korin to pull himself together as they land on a rooftop. But Korin turns to thank Professor Orden, only to find she's already gone. Teft leads him across the rooftops, a blur of motion as they close the distance. The sight of the fallen makes Korin's stomach turn, the guilt of his actions crashing down. But the professor tells him to stay focused, that he's their only chance to end this. Korin sees civilians in danger, but Teft holds him back, warning him not to interfere. He insists they have to keep moving, that they must reach Katashi, but Korin clenches his fist, refusing to just stand by and watch. Just then, a familiar dragon appears on the battlefield below. You know, Mizuchi, the hero's end. The beast roars, crackling with immense power as it prepares to strike. Lord Teft and his simulacra hold their ground against the overwhelming power, but Mizuchi unleashes a devastating blast that shatters the academy grounds. The professor's copies vanish as he collapses, completely out of mana. Korin can only stare at the fallen, the weight of his guilt crushing him. He grips his sword, a single tear falling as the monsters close in. But a sudden blast of fire and ice erupts, and a familiar voice tells him not to die. His friends have arrived, explaining Professor Orden just didn't have the patience to argue. And it seems Jin decided to join the party after all. You know, for moral support. The two of them share a look, a silent understanding passing between them. But Korin is furious, demanding to know why they came back to get themselves killed. Marissa tells him he can't keep trying to protect them by pushing them away. Patrick insists that Korin is the one who needs their support now. They offer to face whatever comes next as a team, together. You know, a classic power of friendship moment. He asks what happens if they fail, and Sarah says they'll do that together too. Korin is moved to tears, finally understanding their loyalty. Sarah promises they'll face his problems together and move forward. He finally smiles, accepting their help as they stand united. The team charges into battle, and Korin realizes he's been so focused on finding his brother that he never saw the family he had right in front of him. A family he hopes Tristan will one day get to meet. The scene shifts back to the mock tower, its entrance glowing with power. Korin stands over the shattered remains of their latest challenge. He offers a confident smirk, his sword held at the ready. His only thought is to keep moving forward no matter what.